The sight of the towering stone pillars that supported a high dome and the mottled and ancient long table that appeared to have been placed there since hundreds, if not more than 1,000 years ago, entered the eyes. Although Audrey Hall had seen this scene many times, she would still feel a kind of shock that came from the bottom of her heart the moment she arrived above the grey fog. Out of the corner of her eye, she scanned the surroundings and didn't see any new members. She then looked up and bowed to the person in the thick grey fog. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." As she spoke, she suddenly saw a card covered with a complicated pattern on the table to the right of the Fool. It was lying there quietly, casually, like an ordinary object. Is that the card of blasphemy? A card of blasphemy that hides one of the paths of the divine. Audrey immediately understood. After the Fool nodded in response, she subconsciously glanced at the Hanged Man, the Sun, and the Magician, and she found that they had also noticed the card that didn't exist in the past. However, their eyes and actions revealed their doubts and astonishment, as well as their inevitable conjectures. After all, a card that could be placed by the mysterious and lofty Mr. Fool was definitely not an ordinary item. Well, Mr. World's reaction is a little odd. He's not even looking there. Is he able to hide his thoughts so well? Is he really the nemesis of a spectator and telepathist? Audrey quickly decided that, other than Mr. Fool, the card of blasphemy was known only to herself. This made her feel quite proud. It was a feeling like sharing a secret with her parents when she was young while she kept her 2 elder brothers in the dark. That's a card of blasphemy created by Emperor Roselle, a treasure that countless Beyonders in the mysterious world dream of. Audrey took the initiative to raise her hand after the Magician, the Sun, and the others did their greetings. "Honorable Mr. Fool, I have something I would like to report to you alone." "Alone?" Alger frowned slightly as he subconsciously tried to guess at the content but was without any clue. Derek and the others were also curious, but they didn't think too much about it. Klein nodded slightly and said, "Sure." Frankly, he had no idea what Miss Justice was going to report to him. After waiting 2 seconds, he blocked off the senses of the rest of the members and gestured to Justice. Audrey sat with a dignified posture and said with a sincere attitude, "Mr. Fool, as I had asked to purchase the spectator formula at a Beyonder gathering, there has been 2 suspected members of the psychology alchemists who came into contact with me recently through certain nobles. I'm inclined to join them, but only if I can guarantee my own safety. What is your opinion on this? I've attached great importance to this. Psychology alchemists. From the evidence from various sources of information, it's not considered an evil organization. At present, they might not have a deity that they believe in. Its main mission is to explore and research one's mind, consciousness, psyche, and spirituality. It's more like a scientific self-help group. Of course, among the Orthodox churches, it's also a form of sacrilege since they believe that everyone's spirit belongs to God. And according to Dax Terguderian, the upper echelons of the psychology alchemists definitely have an inclination, the original creator, the God that created everything, and they worship him to a certain extent, a rather primitive form of worship. Many thoughts flashed past Klein's mind as he finally said with a smile, "If you think it's suitable, you can do so. If you encounter a problem, you can seek help from the Tarot Club. Thank you for your suggestion." Audrey instantly felt relieved. Klein thought for a moment and added using a calm and leisurely tone, "Inside the psychology alchemists, there are people planted by the churches, such as informants of the mandated punishers and nighthawks. You have to know how to hide and conceal yourself. Mr. Fool is so nice to remind me to be careful." Audrey slightly bent her eyes and replied with a shallow smile, "In the future, there will also be an informant from the Tarot Club inside the psychology alchemists. Miss Justice, you haven't even joined, and you're already thinking of betraying them." Klein silently drew an invisible crimson moon for the psychology alchemists. After reporting the matter of the psychology alchemists, Audrey wasn't in a hurry to end the conversation. Instead, she said, "Mr. Fool, I've memorized another 2 pages of Roselle's diary." That was also why she had asked to speak to him in private. If she had conjured Roselle's diary and given it to Mr. Fool under the witness of the magician, Furs, she could imagine that at the end of the gathering, Furs would immediately come to her and borrow those Roselle's notes she had bought in the past. And with regards to this, the goddess could prove that Mr. Fool had seen them all. I forgot to do so previously. One of these 2 days, I'll find an opportunity to tell Furs that the Roselle notes I bought were torn apart by Susie. Yes, torn apart, into pieces that cannot be restored. I'm sorry, Susie. Audrey repented in her heart. Very good. Klein knocked gratefully on the edge of the long bronze table to help Miss Justice conjure the diary pages. When he had the 2 pages in hand, he cast his eyes over, only to have his smile gradually stiffen. The first line of the journal read, March 6th. Damn it, I'm almost constipated from eating the food here. This is what I saw at the Roselle Memorial Exhibition. Klein hid his expression and turned to the second page. He found that the contents were still the complaints and novel experiences of Roselle's early days of his transmigration. They were of no practical use. He controlled his expression and smiled. Do you wish to deduct from the gold pounds you have yet to pay, or do you wish to get something else in return? Audrey said without any hesitation, Mr. Fool, I would like to know which path of the divine that card of blasphemy is. You really treat money as dirt. Klein silently sighed, as he didn't hide his smile as he said, that is the Dark Emperor card. The corresponding sequence 9 is lawyer. So that's what it is. After receiving her answer, Audrey felt abnormally satisfied. After the private conversation ended, the magician, Furs, looked eagerly at the World who sat right at the other end. Mr. World, I will try my best to gather a mystical item or powerful beyonder weapon in the Sun domain. What kind of deal did you two make in private? Despite feeling very familiar with Furs, Audrey wasn't aware of this, so she couldn't help but ask. Furs let out a sigh and said, Mr. World has helped me find the formula to Trick Master. Mr. World sure is capable at finding formulas. Does he have extensive and reliable resources and connections in this field? Audrey listened in surprise. The hanged man, Alger, concealed his solemn expression, once again re-evaluating the World and raising his assessment of him. As for Derek, he felt rather expectant. He hoped that after he finished digesting the light suppliant potion, Mr. World would be able to easily find for him the formula for Sequence 7, Solar High Priest. The World laughed hoarsely when faced with the numerous gazes that were staring at him. Miss Magician, before you purchase it, it's best that you chant Mr. Fool's honorable name and request that he pass the relevant information to me. Yes, I have already sought Mr. Fool's permission and he has agreed to help us. If I'm not satisfied with the items that you have set your eyes on, perhaps I will consider switching to another request. Klein now had 3 alternatives for the items in the Sun domain, so he planned to compare them before making any finalization. One of them was the brooch which old Mr. Eye of Wisdom had mentioned. It had the effect of purifying and warding off evil spirits and letting the wearer use a portion of the spells in the Sun domain. The negative effect was that the wearer would never feel cool, forever stuck in a hot and irritable state. Klein found the mystical item only okay, and since the price could be close to £2,000, he was unable to afford it, even if he had sold the Briber formula, therefore, he planned to wait a few days. If Miss Magician and the lady with the artisan backing her couldn't find something better, then he would cash out the formula and buy the brooch. Okay, I'll give you the information no later than tomorrow. Furs had confirmed that Mr. A would be hosting a gathering that very night, but she had given herself another day for any unexpected outcomes. When the conversation was over, Alger looked around and said, as if he had already prepared a draft, I recently took on an investigative mission. I'm not sure if you have any relevant leads. In the past 2 to 3 years, many original native tribes in the southern continent have been plundered and all their people were taken away. In the various colonies, on the islands at sea, some slaves have also mysteriously escaped. Such situations have not happened in a long time since the countries of the northern continent abolished the slave trade. Have you all heard anything that's relevant? His eyes swept over Justice, the Magician, and the World, but he didn't look at the sun. How could a boy trapped in the City of Silver inside the forsaken land of the gods know about what was happening outside? Audrey carefully recalled the conversations she had heard at the many noble gatherings, but after a while, she said, "No, I've never even heard of such a thing." The magician and the world shook their heads. Is this indicating that slave trading in the black market is flourishing again? Why would they need so many slaves? Klein sat at the end of the long bronze table and thought about the matter suspiciously. Seeing that no one could provide any clues, and how Mr. Fool showed no interest whatsoever by not interrupting, he said without changing his expression, "You can attempt to seek out the formula for Wind Blessed. I will provide you with payment that would absolutely be enough to satisfy you." The formula for the Wind Blessed? He's almost done digesting the potion of the seafarer. Klein activated his spirit vision and glanced at the hanged man. Sure enough, he found that the surface layer of his astral projection was not only pure blue like the sea, but it also had slight ripples, as if slowly undulating. If I do the math, it took Mr. Hanged Man nearly 4 months to digest the seafarer potion. He's often at sea. Audrey also made a judgment based on what she had observed. Another point that Furs paid more attention to was that Mr. Hanged Man was likely a sequence 7. A mid-sequence beyonder, she nodded indiscernibly and said to herself. After the Hanged Man finished announcing his mission, Derek raised his hand and said with some apprehension, "I've been assigned to go on a mission. I will be heading to the half-destroyed temple that I mentioned previously, in the near future, yes, the one related to the fallen creator. The leader responsible for this operation is Shepherd Elder Lovia. Do you have any suggestions?" Suggestions? My advice is to stay as far away as possible. Upon hearing the son's question, Klein instantly had such an answer in his mind. However, in order to preserve the image of the fool and see what the others would suggest, he remained silent and did not manipulate the world to speak. After a short moment of silence, Alger turned his head to look at the sun. He said in a staid and gentle voice, "You have provided too little information, so it's difficult for us to give any useful advice. The only thing we know of regarding that semi-destroyed temple is the presence of the true creator, or in other words, the fallen creator's unique statue. We don't know what else is there, so naturally, we aren't able to make much of an analysis of the situation. The fallen creator is indeed the true creator. To think that there's faith in the true creator in the city of silver where the sun lives. There's even a temple built." The magician first listened with relish and almost wanted to write it down. Just as Audrey waited for the son's description of the strange temple in anticipation. Derek nodded, his eyes looking up for a few seconds before he said, "In addition to the statue, there are also many incomplete murals with terrifying evil spirits lingering around. However, they have already been eliminated by the exploration team led by 2 elders from the 6-member council. I've yet to see those murals with my own eyes. It said that it records the prophecy of the end of days and how the fallen creator will save his believers, as well as the corresponding bloody ritual. In the corner of a certain mural, there are some strange characters that appear to be evolved from Jotun. After some deciphering, a few elders believe that they meant Rose Redemption. This might be a codename for the original muralist. It might also be the codename of the organization that built the temple and the city. According to the chief's judgment, these murals are at least 1,000 years old. The 1,000 years I'm referring to is the one that you know, but I'm not completely sure. In the city of silver, we use the frequency of lightning to demarcate our days. It's considered night when the lightning eases up and day when there's plenty of lightning. 1 cycle is a day, and the 4 seasons only exist in books, so we can't grasp the specific number of days. Only the chief can confirm that." At this point in the son's story, Furs suspected that she was listening to a fairy tale. A city without the sun, without the red moon, without day and night or changes in the seasons, it sounded unreal no matter how she listened to it. Only fairy tales or novels would make such daring descriptions. And the author has to smoke cannabis and be in a state of psychotic madness in order to create such a city. The first thought that came to her mind after her astonishment was, "I want to use the City of Silver as a blueprint for a novel." However, she soon gave up on this idea, for she didn't know what the City of Silver really implied. She wasn't sure if it was a secret that was collectively concealed by the 7 churches, and she was afraid that as soon as the book was published, she, as the author, would have the Nighthawks knocking on her door, claiming to collect the copper pennies in her gas meter. So that's the kind of environment which the City of Silver has. The Sun also often mentions of monsters lurking deep in the darkness. Unfortunately, I'm only at sequence 8. Otherwise, I would really like to ask Mr. Fool to send me there for an adventure. No, Audrey, you are no longer an innocent girl. You should be aware of how much danger is involved in this matter. Just as Audrey switched between letting her thoughts run wild while also engaging in self-reflection. At least 1,000 years? The Aurora Order hasn't been in existence for more than 3 centuries. It might not even be 2 centuries old. It's unlikely to be built by them. Perhaps the true creator's faith had begun as early as the 5th epoch or even the 4th epoch. However, the organization that revered him wasn't the Aurora Order. In the next 1 to 2,000 years, the 7 Orthodox churches have been repressing it, causing the true creator's believers to be in a crisis. The churches have destroyed them again and again, and finally, they had resurrected themselves as the Aurora Order. Klein, who had some guesses, made his seating posture and stayed appear unchanged. Derek paused for 2 seconds and continued, a preliminary cleanup of the terrifying monsters in the city ruins and the half-destroyed temple has been done. Our mission this time is to explore the underground parts of the temple. Do you have any suggestions? With your understanding of the fallen creator, what should I pay attention to? My suggestion? Alger said without almost any hesitation, my advice is absolutely not to go. The fallen creator is a true evil god. Even if his temple has been destroyed, it might still contain abnormal danger which cannot be easily detected. If the one leading your team is one of the other elders of the 6-member council, then there's nothing wrong if you insist on going. It will just be risky. But you just mentioned that the person in charge of this matter is Shepherd Lovia, and the true creator is the deity standing at the peak of this beyonder pathway. Therefore, absolutely do not go, Alger added. Your suggestion is the same as mine, but it doesn't require the sun to describe the half-destroyed temple. You could have come up with this conclusion with the conditions at the beginning. I understand. Mr. Hanged Man, you were doing it on purpose. This way, you got a rough idea of the state of the temple without paying anything. You're really just bullying a little kid. Sitting at the end of the table, Klein leisurely reached out his hand to support his forehead. The sun was silent for a few seconds, and seemingly having been put in a tough spot, he said, but the mission is compulsory. The Hanged Man chuckled and said, nothing is necessary. Will you still be participating in patrols before this mission? Find an opportunity and deliberately let the monsters injure you. As for how serious it should be, you can reference the past cases in the City of Silver. At this moment, Audrey read a message from Sun's eyes and movements. That actually works? After a brief period of surprise and confusion, Derek frowned and said, but I don't have any patrolling missions in the near future. Alger sneered. You can always pretend to be on the brink of losing control. No, to be precise, you can push yourself to the brink of losing control. Under such a situation, I believe the higher-ups of the City of Silver would definitely not bring dangerous baggage with them on the exploratory mission, right? There is a trick. As long as you keep your spirituality in an empty state for 2 days, you will begin to hear auditory hallucinations and show signs of losing control. If you stop suppressing yourself, then your situation will improve in a week, and you wouldn't really lose control. Of course, your City of Silver definitely has some solutions and contingencies to cure those who show signs of losing control. Your recovery would definitely be quick, so you need to time yourself perfectly. It's best if you start doing so 2 to 3 days before you set off. Derek was stunned for quite a while before he muttered to himself, yes, those who show signs of losing control will be placed under control and be quarantined underground in the spire, where they will be treated with medicine, rituals, and mystical items. If the situation isn't too serious, then they only need to consume medicine. Sigh, an honest and good kid has been corrupted by an old fox just like that. But, Mr. Hanged Man, how do you know of this trick of pushing yourself to the brink of losing control? If you use this trick often, losing control might really happen. Klein sighed in his heart. Audrey was dumbstruck when she heard this. She felt as though she'd been educated. Seeing that the son was still hesitating as though he didn't wish to lie to the City of Silver's elders, Alger slowly asked, "Do the other elders of the 6-member council know that the fallen creator controls the shepherd pathway?" "They don't." Derek shook his head honestly. Alger asked again, "Do you think it's possible that Shepherd Elder Lovia will do harm to the City of Silver?" "Just answer yes or no, there's no need for any explanations." "Yes." Derek finally couldn't lie to himself. Alger chuckled and said, "So, you are the only one who knows of this matter, but you haven't found a way to warn the other elders of the 6-member council, right?" "Yes." Derek's expression grew heavier. Alger changed his seating posture as he leaned back. "This mission carries immense risk. This is something you know. If you die in that half-destroyed temple, then who will be able to find a way to expose the strangeness of Shepherd Lovia? Who can save the City of Silver from this crisis? The fallen creator is a real evil god. You are not pretending to lose control or lying to others for your own personal interests. You are doing so to save the City of Silver. Comparing your honor to that, which is more important?" Derek clenched his teeth and nodded solemnly. "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man." Audrey and Fur suddenly had the urge to facepalm themselves. He really is an easily fooled child. However, that's good too, it prevents the Tarot Club from losing members in the near future. Klein sighed silently as he controlled the world to say, "I have a question to ask Mr. Sun. This could involve a transaction. Therefore, I'm requesting a private exchange." Klein quickly switched back to himself and nodded indifferently. "Sure." After the others were screened, the world looked at the sun and asked, "Does the City of Silver have a way to remove an evil god's mental corruption on a Beyonder characteristic?" This was something Klein had wanted to ask a few times before, but considering that Justice and the others might also be interested, and if the sun was unable to answer questions that involved an evil god, then all eyes would likely be cast toward the godlike Mr. Fool. Therefore, he had restrained his impulse. It was only moments ago when he got inspiration from Miss Justice and came up with the idea of communicating privately. "We have never encountered an evil god." Derek answered earnestly, "We can only separate a rampager's mental corruption from a Beyonder characteristic." "That's it. This might actually work, after all, I have the gray fog." Klein suppressed his joy and made the world speak, "What do you need in return?" "It's not a matter of compensation." Sun shook his head. "That method and the corresponding knowledge requires me to be at least the captain of a patrol team, or even a strong warrior like the captain of an exploration team in order to be privy to such matters. The former requires being sequence 7, while the latter requires a minimum of sequence 6. Phew. Klein sighed, letting the world hoarsely say, "I hope that you can attain the qualifications as soon as possible." After the private communication between the world and the sun, the tarot gathering began its free discussion session. Audrey asked with great interest about the unique scenery of the sea and of any strange happenings, while Alger gave selective descriptions according to his own knowledge. Furs listened quietly and was inspired to write a novel about a pirate king, of how he captures a female passenger and has a complex love affair with her, a fantasy that coexisted with reality. Derek could only imagine what the sea looked like based on the paintings in the City of Silver and the corresponding words. In the end, Klein, whose spirituality was gradually drained, announced the end of the tarot gathering. After which, he quickly returned to the real world and made up for it with a nap. 7:30 at night. In Empress Borough. Inside a particular noble's house. Furs put on a hooded robe. After so many days, she was once again attending the gathering organized by Mr. A. She sat quietly in a corner, and whilst pretending to casually survey her surroundings, she noticed that Mr. A, who was sitting alone on the sofa, seemed a little different from before. This wasn't a change in appearance or temperament, because the other party's face was completely hidden in the shadow of his hood, preventing her from making out anything. The difference she felt was an almost intuitive feeling. Mr. A is no longer as carefree and indifferent as before, with him always looking at everyone in a supercilious manner. The current him seems to be very repressed, like he's trying his best to control something. He feels a lot more dangerous now. In the past, Mr. A was a mountain. Now, he's more like a reared-up snake, sticking out its tongue vociferously. The best-selling writer, Furs, suddenly felt grateful that she hadn't gotten Zio to come with her since she needed to hide matters about the Tarot Club and not let her know that she was looking for something in the Sun domain. This way, even if there are any accidents, my escape would be much easier. She rotated the bracelet, which only had 2 stones left. She was in no hurry to write down her request to hand over to the attendant. Instead, she patiently observed for a while. It wasn't that she was naturally cautious, but the lessons of the past had left her with deep impressions. The 2 stones on her bracelet were evidence of this. After waiting for more than 10 minutes, she finally picked up a piece of paper and a pen in front of her and wrote in deliberately distorted handwriting, seeking to buy mystical items or powerful beyonder weapons in the Sun domain. After handing the note to the attendant, Furs looked around again, but she couldn't find the eternal blazing sun believer, who had helped with the purification and exorcism ritual, among the disguised or masked figures. Trades took place as the attendant shuttled about. The entire hall remained quiet and orderly. After an exchange in the middle of the gathering, Furs's request was added to the 2 chalkboards right in front. Not long after, she received a reply from the attendant. A small slip of white paper was filled with dense words. Mystical item, Band of Light Ring. It can make the wearer an envoy of light, an attendant of the sun. They will be immune to various diseases and wield sacred powers. The wearer can summon blinding light and use several spells in the Sun domain. It can purify all dead spirits in a 50-meter radius. It is the nemesis of such creatures. If the wearer is acknowledged by the ring, they will be enhanced, otherwise, they will be weakened. The only problem is that if the wearer utilizes it too often, they will slowly become a believer of the eternal blazing sun and slowly defend the doctrines and praise the sun from the bottom of their hearts. If you wish to obtain it, then please pay me 9,000 in cash at once. I can wait for you to raise it. 9,000 pounds? Furs's mouth gaped open, as though the other party was robbing her. This was a huge amount of wealth that she wouldn't be able to borrow, even if she asked someone to lend it to her. Aside from the deposit for the assassination of the Intis ambassador, the amount of money she had seen so far combined had never been this high. A person with 9,000 pounds in cash was considered a tycoon, even in Backland. Although I know that mystical items are expensive, I never expected them to be this expensive. Does he plan on getting the 9,000 pounds and not participate in Beyonder gatherings anymore and leave the circle so as to enjoy life in peace? For a moment, she didn't dare to reply to the seller. She pretended that nothing had happened and listened for nearly 10 minutes, but when she received no additional response to relatively inexpensive Beyonder weapons, she got up and went to the washroom. After confirming that no one was around, she closed the toilet door and sat down on the toilet. She recited Mr. Fool's honorable name, told him in prayer about what had just happened, and asked him to pass it on to the world. Klein, who had heard the layered, illusory sounds, quickly went above the endless gray fog and gained a basic understanding of the situation. 9,000 pounds? He mouthed the number, his expression twisting slightly. After silently calculating the amount of money he could raise in a short period of time, he let out a breath, conjured the fake person, the world, and manipulated him to give a response. The negative effect of this mystical item is too serious. I do not wish to be a believer of the sun. You don't have to worry about this anymore. We'll transact using cash instead. Pay 450 pounds and you'll get the formula for Trickmaster. The moment he finished his sentence, he cut the connection. Watching as the world disappeared, he raised his hand to rub his forehead and muttered to himself, "Next, I'll have to see the information on what kind of items that barbarian lady can gather. Otherwise, I can only purchase that brooch from Eye of Wisdom." In the washroom, Furs let out a sigh of relief. She indicated that she would hold the sacrificial ritual as soon as she got back. It's a pity that I don't know the formula for now. Otherwise, I could take the opportunity to see if there are any Beyonder ingredients I need. She returned to the hall and focused on the information on the 2 blackboards. She didn't respond to the previous note, much less consider bargaining. Even if the seller was willing to discount it by £1,000, she wouldn't have the money or liquidity to buy it, and more importantly, she felt that Mr. World couldn't afford it either. She stayed until the end of the gathering, and because of Mr. A's changes, she didn't linger or talk to anyone. She quickly left the house. After more than 10 minutes, the gathering came to a complete end, leaving Mr. A and his attendants alone. Slowly, Mr. A got up and walked down the stairs to the basement. Suddenly, his knees buckled, and he fell to the ground, rolling down several steps. He was sprawled on the ground, and the shadow beneath him quickly turned scarlet red. His flesh and blood melted and mixed into the shadow, making it look like a brand new, skinless, monster-like person that had been separated from his body. Gasp! Gasp! Mr. A's breathing gradually returned to normal as his taut body gradually relaxed. The blood and flesh, that had separated, flowed back once again. Everything returned back to normal. Mr. A crawled forward and knelt in the basement, once again confessing his sins while choking with sobs. He was confessing for his oversight from before, that he wasn't vigilant enough and caused the Lord's descent to fail. City of Silver, Derek Berg's house. He walked in silence a few times around the table, unable to make up his mind. His reasoning told him that Mr. Hanged Man's suggestion was the best one, but the faces of the other members participating in the mission kept flashing in his mind, and he felt that he had abandoned and betrayed them by pretending to lose control. Is there no way to save them? Should I find a chance to meet with the chief and tell him that the half-destroyed temple belongs to the fallen creator, who's an evil god that controls the shepherd pathway? That he should be careful of Elder Lovia and change the person responsible for the mission. But how should I explain where I got this information from? In their eyes, Mr. Fool would be the same as an evil god. Derek pulled his hair in frustration. The axe of Hurricane was placed in a position that was within reach of his hands. Every time a bolt of lightning streaked past the window, it emitted a faint light. Suddenly, Derek stopped and looked out into the darkness and into the dark sky. It was as if he had once again seen the state his parents were in before their deaths. He found the pain he had experienced when he stabbed his sword downwards. There's no time. I need to make preparations for the future so that I wouldn't be suspected for my discovery of that god being the fallen creator. As his expression distorted, he clenched his teeth and muttered to himself. He then suddenly left the side of the window and went back to the table. He began practicing the light suppliants beyond her powers to drain his spirituality as quickly as possible. In the Hall family's luxurious villa. In an art studio, Audrey leisurely smeared oil paint when she heard a rhythmic knock on the door. When her maidservant, Annie, opened the door, she saw that it was her mother, Countess Caitlin. Although this lady was close to 50 years old, she looked to be in her early 30s. She had blonde hair, green eyes, and a beautiful and graceful appearance, enough to attract the attention of most gentlemen. "Mother, is something the matter?" Audrey put down the items in her hand and stood up, puzzled. The Countess looked at her daughter, who was even more beautiful than her younger self. She smiled and said, "I just attended a dinner party. Lady Della said that you're very interested in psychology and that you wanted to hire a tutor, didn't you?" "Yes, but I haven't decided yet." Audrey replied hesitantly on purpose, just like she usually did. How could the Countess not see through her daughter's thoughts? She smiled and said, "She recommended a psychiatrist named Escalante. If you have no problem with that, I'll send someone to invite her to tutor you twice a week. How about that?" "It's your decision." Audrey's smile blossomed, bit by bit. "Mother, come and sit here. I'm lacking a beautiful model." On Tuesday morning, Klein confirmed through the Backland Morning Post that Eye of Wisdom's gathering would be held tomorrow night. He was relieved as he was no longer worried that his acquisition of the items he needed wouldn't be in time for Miss Sharon's attack on the enemy. To celebrate the good news, he decided to take a day off at the Quelag Club. Underground shooting range of the Quelag Club. When he was done shooting, Klein meticulously serviced his free revolver and adjusted the ratio of purifying bullets, demon hunting bullets, and exorcism bullets to 3 to 1 to 1. Phew. He exhaled, put away the revolver, tidied his coat, and slowly walked back to the hall on the first floor. He had already heard from the attendant that the dish that was in limited supply today was pan-fried dragonbone fish. As soon as he entered the buffet cafeteria, Klein saw an acquaintance, Talon Dumont, the equestrian teacher from an abject noble family with short brown curls. He was eating his lunch with unfocused eyes. Klein carried his plate over, sat down, and greeted him. Talon turned his head and glanced at him. His lips quivered a few times, and after 3 or 4 seconds of silence, he finally opened his mouth and mumbled, "Sherlock, do you know rare people who have strange abilities and are very powerful?" "Yes, the one in front of you is one." Klein's eyebrows twitched. He didn't give a direct answer. "What do you want to do?" Talon opened his mouth but said nothing. With a solemn expression, he thought for a while before he squeezed out a smile and said, "It's nothing. I was just asking out of curiosity." He had asked what should a person do if he fell in love with someone he shouldn't have the last time, and this time, he's asking if I know of anyone with strange abilities. Is he trying to get rid of the other party and completely sever his friend's fantasies? Who's worth the risk? Hiring a killer is equivalent to murder. Klein mumbled silently, cut a piece of the fish without any fine bones, and stuffed it into his mouth. Talon drew a breath, finished the food from his plate quickly, and wiped his mouth with a napkin. He seemed to return to normal as he said with a smile, "Mike wants to hire you for a few days to be his bodyguard." "Mike Joseph? The reporter from the Daily Observer? I remember his performance at the Golden Rose was rather brilliant." Klein chuckled. "What does Mike want to do now?" Talon spread out his hands and said, "I'm not sure. He just casually mentioned this matter. It seems to have something to do with an interview. He said that he will visit you the day after tomorrow. I hope you have the time to accept this commission." "I can't be sure." Klein, who didn't know the details, didn't give an affirmative answer. At that moment, he heard a series of illusory pleas from a woman. "Miss Magician? Is she prepared to sacrifice the money in exchange for the formula?" Klein picked up his speed and finished the rest of his food. Then, he downed the black tea and went to the reception desk to get the attendant to open a lounge for him. After sealing the room with a wall of spirituality, he went above the gray fog and found that his judgment was correct. Miss Magician was requesting to hold the sacrificial ritual. The reason for her delay was that she only had £370 on her, and she had to go to the bank to withdraw some of her savings. After a series of maneuvering, she saw the £450 vanish into the illusionary door, and an additional formula appeared in her mind. Sequence 8. Trickmaster. Main ingredients: stomach pouch of a spirit eater, 20 milliliters of a deep-sea marlin's blood. Supplementary ingredients: 5 milliliters of essential oils made from hornbeam, 10 grams of string grass powder, a blossoming red chestnut flower, 80 milliliters of pure water. I've finally obtained it. It's been years. Furs couldn't help pacing back and forth, feeling overjoyed and proud. Then, not feeling at ease, she took out a pen and a piece of paper, recording down the formula so that she wouldn't forget it and end up having to trouble Mr. Fool. If I don't meet someone who doesn't know the market well, then the main ingredient is at least £300, and I only have £430 left. I still need to work hard to earn more money. I am going to write a new book. Furs suddenly felt that she was brimming with motivation. She was no longer the procrastinator she had been before. 5 minutes to 8 on a Wednesday evening, carrying all his savings, Klein entered the house where the gathering organized by Eye of Wisdom was held. He was wearing a black robe, with the hood over his face, and an iron mask. £1,674 in cash and 5 gold coins. This is the new peak of my wealth. I wonder how much will remain after this gathering. Klein entered the living room and scanned the room with the help of the candle's flickering light. The apothecary didn't come. Is he caught up with something? Klein frowned slightly and sat in the same position as he did the previous time. After a few minutes, Eye of Wisdom clapped his hands and said, "Let's begin." Before he could finish his sentence, someone impatiently spoke up. It was the heavily shrouded lady who seemed to have an artisan backing her. She suppressed her voice and asked, "Is the friend who wanted to sell the briber formula last time here?" "I'm here," Klein answered simply. The lady heaved a sigh of relief, pushed her iron mask down and said, "This time, there's a beyonder weapon that you need. Of course, you can also choose cash." "What's the beyonder weapon?" Klein suppressed the eagerness in his heart. The lady organized her words and said, "This is a whip woven from the feathers of the holy sunbird. You can usually disguise it as a belt. When used, it will be covered with pure holy flames of light. Any undead monsters that are whipped by it will suffer great damage, and the weaker ones would even be directly obliterated. It can also be used to soak in liquids to create sun holy water. But that would reduce the spirituality's durability. Every use will decrease its durability by a month. Currently, it has 13 months of effective durability. If you are willing, you can exchange it for the briber formula without paying any additional cash." "Holy sunbird?" "It's not the sun divine bird. If it's the latter's feathers, I'll take it. Of course, only tail feathers would do. They can be used to concoct the sequence for's unshadowed potion." Klein was quite satisfied with the weapon itself, but the problem was that it could only be used for 13 months. Every time he made sun holy water, the durability would be reduced by a month. In time, he would have to replenish it with something similar. With this in mind, he turned to look at the seat of honor. "Mr. Eye of Wisdom, can you describe, in detail, the brooch you introduced last time?" "Oh, write it down on paper and indicate the price that would satisfy you." He was afraid that the others would be interested in the brooch and thus raise the price, so he decided at the last second to get Eye of Wisdom to write it down. "All right." Eye of Wisdom laughed and asked an attendant to bring him a pen and paper. While he was writing, the members of the gathering continued their trade. There were even some who were tempted as they asked about the price of the whip, only to receive an answer to wait. After a while, the Eye of Wisdom finished writing the introduction and passed it to Klein through the attendant. When Klein unrolled it, he saw that the words on the paper were written in print, preventing him from noticing anything special about them. Very careful. He started to read carefully. Sun Brooch. It can also be called Midsummer, and it is considered a relatively weaker Grade 2 sealed artifact. With it acting as the center, it will fill a 10-meter radius with pure and warm energy. Normal people will not be able to sense it, but undead spirits and monsters will suffer constant damage, and they will quickly evaporate like a pool of water under a blazing fireball. Even wraiths and shadows will suffer the same fate, albeit lasting a little longer. In such an environment, the strength of powerful undead creatures will be significantly weakened. It will be very difficult for the wearer to be possessed or corrupted by evil spirits or monsters. Allows use of spells such as Holy Light Summoning, Holy Water Creation, Fire of Light, Cleave of Purification, Horror Immunity, Holy Oath, and Sun Halo. The downside is that, as long as you carry it, you will never be able to feel cool. You will always be experiencing a terrible heat. Young man, don't underestimate this state. The hot and irritated you will slowly step into the abyss of losing control. I will only sell it for 2,000 pounds. Don't try to bargain. As you know, I'm not too short of money, and I'm a collector. It's much stronger than I imagined. Eye of Wisdom had been very vague the last time. Klein's heart skipped a beat. After a few seconds of thought, he looked over at the woman with the artisan backing her. 900 pounds in cash. The average price for a Sequence 7 potion formula was around 800 pounds. Deal, the lady answered without hesitation. If I had known, I would have offered 1,000 pounds. Klein forced a smile. He was a man of his word, and, without reneging his offer, he exchanged his prepared formula for 900 pounds in cash. In an instant, his wealth soared to 2,574 pounds. It was enough to make a bachelor man live a pretty good life for the rest of his life. After Eye of Wisdom's appraisal, the lady looked at the formula once more in satisfaction. Sequence 7, Briber. Main ingredients, 1 weeping infant flower, strange-faced cannabis crystal. Supplementary ingredients, 5 drops of golden jimsonweed juice, 5 drops of black jimsonweed juice, 4 drops of fantasy grass essential oil, 80 milliliters of red wine. After completing the transaction, Klein drew a deep breath, looked at Eye of Wisdom, and solemnly said, £2,000. I want that Sun Brooch. Eye of Wisdom chuckled and said, to be honest, I really don't wish to sell it, but since I have 2-081, Sun Brooch isn't necessary to me. Besides, I have already named my price, and reneging isn't my style. Wait 3 minutes for me. I'll get the Sun Brooch. Alright, Klein replied, feeling both expectant and also feeling the pinch. At this point, the Beyonders in the activity room cast their gazes on him. A deal of £2,000 rarely appeared at this level of ordinary gatherings, perhaps not even once in a year or two. Klein could feel the greed and covetous feelings in their eyes. After a short silence, the transactions continued until Eye of Wisdom returned. In his open palm lay a dark golden brooch shaped like a sunbird. It was obvious that the Eye of Wisdom had some sweat on his face. At. You can confirm it before you pay. The hooded Eye of Wisdom walked directly to Klein and handed the dark golden brooch to him. Very generous. Klein reached out to take it, but before he could examine it closely, he felt his surroundings become very hot, even the wind felt as if it had been ignited. Once it entered his nose, it would spread to his lungs. At this moment, he seemed to have left the cold and humid backland, finding himself in the desert and wilderness, right in the middle of the northern continent. Hanging above him was the sun that radiated endless light and heat, and in his surroundings was the extremely dry and boundless yellow sand. Phew, it makes me want to eat ice cream. Sweat slowly seeped out of Klein's forehead, but under the iron mask, the liquid couldn't fall freely. It could only stick on the spot. Through direct contact, he could feel the pure and warm power radiating out, but the Beyonders around him were not at. 346 A magician before going on stage plus, turn off reset. At 10 o'clock at night, in the alley by the back door of the Bravehearts bar. Like the previous time, Klein, in his black double-breasted frock coat and matching half-top hat, had merely circled the bar once before he walked to the nearest street as though he were on a stroll. Just as he walked out of the alley, a carriage stopped in front of him. Behind the glass window was Merrick's pair of brown eyes which were still suppressing any signs of malicious intent. Klein pressed the top of his half-top hat and, holding the sturdy cane in his hand, calmly boarded the carriage as if he had hailed it himself. He sat down and straightened his bow tie like a gentleman attending a banquet. That outfit isn't suitable for battle. Merrick, who was wearing a white shirt, black vest, and tights, sized him up a few times and frowned. It was obvious that he still had some doubts regarding Klein's strength, but he had chosen to trust Sharon. Klein smiled casual at. Running ahead of the group was Merrick. His disheveled hair was completely blown back by the wind, and his expression was twisted and hideous. He was even faster than a steam locomotive at its peak speed. With a whoosh, he arrived at the entrance to the clearing. But even so, he was still unable to escape from his pursuers. The closest figure to him was a man who had the same pale complexion as himself, with indistinct, dark patches on his face, as if they were healing marks from rotting wounds. The malice in his eyes was completely undisguised and unrestrained. He looked more like a zombie who was craving fresh flesh rather than a human being, and Klein guessed that he was Jason, a sequence 6. The distance between Jason and Merrick remained within 7 or 8 meters, sometimes lengthening, sometimes shortening. This repeated again and again, as they ventured back and forth. More than 10 meters behind them, a figure was left far behind. It was a thin but muscular man, his hair was shaved very short, and his hair stood erect like spikes. As he swung his arms, the tip of his palms flashed with a metallic light, reflecting the weak crimson moonlight. Those were black fingernails which were as long as daggers. Werewolf tire. Klein chanted the person's sequence and name silently. In his mind, the wall that was splashed with blood appeared in his mind. It was a scene with intestines and limbs splattered all over the ground. Tap. 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 Merrick used all his strength as he ran while Jason gritted his teeth and ran as fast as he could. At some point, the healed dark spots on his face began to swell, as if some sort of rotten liquid was about to ooze out. The two of them left the puddles of water and moist soil that were turning into white frost in their wake. The withered weeds were lifted up by the wind created by the two of them. As they slowly fell down, they began to rot and decay at a speed visible to the naked eye. Suddenly, a pale hand reached out of the frosted soil and accurately grabbed Jason's ankle. "Pa!" Jason twisted his body and forcefully kicked out, breaking the hand's wrist and sending it flying. The remaining stump's flesh and blood had long since rotten, and white maggots struggled to squirm outwards. Merrick stopped, pinched his lips with his right hand, and let out a shrill whistle. Bang! 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 The soil in different parts of the clearing were lifted, and the expressionless corpses sat up. At the same time, a chilly wind suddenly swirled. Countless transparent shadows seemed to have caught the scent of a bloody feast, and none of them wanted to fall behind as they rushed towards Jason. Some pulled his arms, some pulled his calves, and some even hugged his head. Jason stopped and grunted. The shadows flew out, one after another, some of them screamed miserably and disappeared, while others stayed in their original spots, lost. At almost the same time, Merrick and Jason both raised their right hands, thumbs held up beside their forefingers, with their index fingers aiming at each other. Silently, the air between them exploded as black wisps of air billowed upwards. Merrick took a step back, and a few strands of his disheveled hair withered in a blink of an eye and fluttered to the ground. "Merrick, you're still so weak. You still don't understand how to use the power of desire," Jason said with a low, hoarse laugh. At this moment, Werewolf Tyre had already arrived at his side. As for Steve, the Sequence 5 Beyonder in charge of the operation, was nowhere to be found. "Don't be in such a hurry to finish off Merrick. Wait for Sharon to come and save him, Lord Steve is about to arrive," Werewolf Tyre whispered to Jason. He then extended his bright red tongue and licked his lips. "I wonder what Sharon will look like when she has her clothes off." Before he could finish his sentence, he suddenly saw Jason turn his head. His face was deathly pale, and there were two identical figures in his eyes. Black regal dress, light blonde hair, exquisite face, and pale skin. "Pa!" He struck out with both palms and gripped Werewolf Tyre's neck. The creaking sound of bones giving way sounded out. Wraith Sharon had attacked. Tyre inhaled sharply, making his neck bulge like a water pipe. It grew strands of stiff black hair and briefly resisted the force that would snap his windpipe and neck. His eyes gradually rolled backward, showing its whites as his red tongue hung out and sticky saliva drooled down his lips. However, his right hand had accurately reached into his pocket. He had cracked a preset spirituality seal. The empty clearing, together with the warehouses, suddenly lit up as crimson moonlight filled the entire area. Jason's grip on Werewolf Tyre's neck began to weaken, and a figure in a small, soft hat appeared behind him. Tyre's face broke into a smile that was both smug and cruel. His right hand took out a miniature full moon from his pocket, a crimson full moon. It was a dark red accessory that constantly emitted a serene luster. Shaped like a full moon, it had crimson rubies embedded along its circumference. In the middle was a symbol that symbolized the moon, as well as many other mysterious labels. Sharon narrowed her eyes instinctively and retreated 2 steps back. Her incorporeality slowly receded. Her legs no longer seemed capable of supporting her weight. She fell limply to the ground, her black and complicated regal dress stained with dust and mud. Werewolf Tyre raised the palm-sized round accessory high up into the air, laughing as he gasped for breath. Lord Steve was right. You would definitely attempt to counterattack. And Sharon, your target for possession would definitely be Jason, whose sequence is higher than mine. Therefore, the Scarlet Lunar Corona was given to me. Guess, where is he now? This isn't as Sharon had expected. It seems like I can only choose the best opportunity to strike myself. Klein frowned as he heard this, and he forcefully suppressed the anxiety in his heart. At this point, Werewolf Tyre was in no hurry to attack. He knew that the longer the effects of the scarlet lunar corona lasted, the weaker Sharon would become, and the more Merrick would be in pain. In Jason's cold eyes, which usually had a hint of savagery and madness, there was no longer any rationality in them left. He was also affected by the scarlet lunar corona, but he was used to indulging in his desires, so he didn't feel any pain. Instead, he felt a thirst for the fresh flesh before his eyes. Gasp! Jason let out a low, inhuman growl from his throat. His exposed skin and hair turned white. At that moment, Sharon raised her arms with difficulty and used her left hand to remove the black glove that she wore on her right palm. Jason happened to lunge at her, and a thin layer of ice covered the soil around her. Suddenly, endless rays of light burst forth from Sharon's palm. As they fed on Sharon's spirituality, they interweaved in front of the doll-like lady to form a bronze door, which was covered with mysterious patterns and filled with an indescribable smell. The door swung open with a creak and a crack appeared. From the crack, pairs of pale or transparent hands or arms covered in teeth or bloody, skinless arms, stretched out, crossed the void, and grabbed zombie Jason. Indescribable pairs of eyes were hidden in the darkness behind the door, quietly watching the prey in front of them. Before he could even react, Jason was grabbed by the arms, and he was entangled by smooth and incorporeal tentacles. These tentacles were dark green vines that had countless baby faces protruding out. These strange entities were crying and laughing as they tried to drag zombie Jason behind the door. Even though his thoughts were completely controlled by his bloodlust and the urge to kill, Jason instinctively felt afraid. Gasp! The sound from his throat suddenly intensified, and layers of frost immediately appeared on the worrisome-looking arm. The dark green vines that protruded from the babies' faces emitted painful groans as they continuously dripped with decayed, turbid yellow liquid. The pulling force abated, but it did not disappear. Jason kept directing ghosts to interfere, but it was like throwing a stone into the sea. Even when he tried to use spells from Death's domain, they failed to deliver any striking results. His body began moving uncontrollably towards the crack of the illusory mysterious door. Occasionally, he would manage to struggle and retreat a little. As he had taken a sedative in advance, Merrick was not completely taken down by the pain. Taking advantage of this, he took out the last 2 sedatives, broke the bottle with a snap, and drank 1.5 glasses in one go. The suppressed malice in his eyes weakened, and his twisted expression returned to normal. He swept his gaze at Werewolf Tyre. At the same time, with a swoosh, Tyre's thin but muscular body disappeared and reappeared more than 10 meters away. As his figure began outlining itself, an illusory image was left behind. A black aura that seemed to be alive rose up from the ground, pierced through the remnant images, and disappeared with a flicker. Tyre hadn't used Blink, as his sequence didn't have the corresponding Beyonder powers to do so. He had relied on the scarlet lunar corona to push him to his maximum speed. The speed at which he moved it produced afterimages. At that moment, Klein, who was hiding in the shadows at the top of the warehouse, also reached into his pocket with his left hand, touching the iron cigarette case. He removed its surface spirituality cage and gently opened the case. He was sure that Wraith Steve had already arrived at the scene, otherwise, Jason definitely would have been dragged behind the terrible door if the deadlock continued. As for Werewolf Tyre, despite being augmented by the scarlet lunar corona, he was unable to instantly finish Merrick off. When Sharon aimed the door of mysteries at the werewolf, the scarlet lunar corona would end up changing owners. As soon as Klein's fingers touched the all-black eye inside the metal cigarette case, his mind filled with crazy, fell, and terrifying ravings. There were terrifying ravings that made his blood vessels bulge. He felt as though his eyes were cracking, and his head could explode at any moment. And in the midst of these ravings, Klein saw strange, mysterious, and illusory black threads. They were divided into groups, some of them extending to Sharon's body, some of them from Werewolf Tyre. They intertwined with each other without entangling themselves as they extended into the void. Among them, many of the black lines came from a spot not far away from Merrick, and they didn't overlap. Wraith Steve. He wants to possess Merrick. With a thought, Klein retracted his left hand. Instead of drawing his gun to shoot, he snapped his fingers without making much of a sound. Boom! An explosion suddenly occurred between the two warehouses. The raging flames and heat caused a figure wearing a black double-breasted frock coat to float out. After catching the attention of the others, Klein quickly drew his gun and pulled the trigger at the spot he remembered. At the same time, the dark golden sunbird brooch on his chest flashed with a ray of light. He added cleave of purification to the purifying bullet. Bang! The bullet shot out with a faint golden beam of light. A faint golden stream of light flashed past, hitting what seemed like an empty space. However, resplendent flames suddenly rose up from that spot, rapidly forming a silhouette who was wearing a black tuxedo and a dark red cloak. The figure's left arm was burning with holy and pure flames as it continuously emitted faint black and green smoke, illuminating his pale face in dark green glow. It was a man in his 40s with oily hair that was neatly combed with meticulous attention. His eyes were dark and green, and while possessing no emotion, there were no signs of pain. Wraith Steve. He turned his head and looked maliciously at Klein, who was at the top of the warehouse. Klein was startled as he felt his body suddenly turn cold. Even the heat brought by the Sun Brooch couldn't counteract it. His body stiffened quickly, and his eyes glazed over. His pupils reflected the same two figures, a black tuxedo, a dark red cloak, a head of hair slathered with oil, a pair of dark green eyes, and the pale face of a man in his 40s. Almost in an instant, Klein was placed under Steve's control, his thoughts gradually numbing. This was the ability of a Sequence 5 Wraith. It was a strange and hardly defensible ability. Fortunately, he was adequately aware of everything beforehand and was already prepared for it. Moreover, the exorcism effect could effectively resist the possession of evil spiritual beings, so before his ability to think had completely disappeared, he stimulated the spirituality of his spirit body and injected it into the dark golden sunbird brooch. Just as he was about to raise his hand to grab hold of his neck, a warm and pure ray of light suddenly descended from the sky. It was like a pillar of light from the sun, bringing with it a feeling of brilliance and holy purification as it enveloped Klein within. It was a spell from the sun domain, holy light summoning. Amidst the holy light, the formless possession ability was weakened, and Klein's eyes suddenly regained their luster. In close succession, his body ignited, becoming brittle and charred, leaving behind a thin piece of paper. At the same time, between the gaps of the two warehouses, Klein, in his double-breasted frock coat and matching silk half-top hat, jumped out of the roaring flames from the previous explosion. His cane had been thrown away somewhere long ago, and the same figure floating above his head had also been successfully destroyed by the flames. It turned into pieces of ashes and scattered in every direction. Before Klein could confirm his situation, he felt an invisible grip on his ankle. There was a firm grip on his calves, arms, chest, and clothes. In his spirit vision, which had long been activated, Klein saw blurry, transparent figures. Some of them were incomplete, some were covered in blood, some of them had burnt black skin, and others were pale and cold. Phew! A cold wind of unknown origins blew at his neck, making his hair stand on end and made his body tremble uncontrollably. The dark golden sunbird brooch in front of him suddenly flashed with a brilliant light, and golden illusory flames started flaring up around him one after another. These flames emitted the aura of the sun, and because they were so dense, they formed a sea. This was the fire of light from the sun domain. The ghastly ghosts around Klein shrieked silently and vanished, and the cold wind at the back of his head was replaced by the scorching heat of the sun brooch. Klein, who was temporarily safe in this environment, couldn't help but sigh in fear. Even though he had prepared ahead of time and had obtained items to counter his opponent, a one-on-one battle with a Sequence 5 Wraith was still precarious. The performance had almost ended in failure from the very beginning. Not too far away from Merrick, the dark red-cloaked Steve's figure turned slightly incorporeal. The bright flames on his left arm were quickly extinguished under the onslaught of the black aura. His eyes shone with dark green light, filled with malice and desire. He seemed to have lost his mind and ability to think. At this moment, with the shot's warning, Merrick had distanced himself and directed the numb-faced zombies who had crawled out of the earth to surround Werewolf Tyre. He created slippery layers of ice and rotting sludge in an attempt to affect his enemies' movements. Werewolf Tyre held on to the tiny full moon that was emitting crimson light as he ran without stopping. When he was blocked by a zombie, he casually swiped down. Whoosh! The zombie was immediately split into 6 pieces. The long rotten flesh and wriggling maggots sprinkled all over the ground. Werewolf Tyre froze for a moment, looking at his claws in disbelief. Only then did he understand that the augmentation that the scarlet lunar corona brought him wasn't only restricted to speed. He felt that he had mastered some powerful and strange spell. Tyre stopped running and turned to face the pale Merrick. At this moment, zombie Jason was drawing closer to the illusory but mysterious door. His body was covered with dark green vines that had protruded from the faces of the babies. He was being dragged by arms that were either full of teeth or were skinless. His eyes were almost touching the crack of the bronze door as he stared coldly at the indescribable eyes hidden in the darkness. It was as if that place was the final resting place for his heart. No. His body, which was controlled by bloodlust and the desire to kill, shouted out shrilly. Werewolf Tyre, who was about to counterattack, stopped instantaneously. Clenching his teeth, he threw the miniature version of the crimson full moon at Steve. Only by allowing a sequence 5 Beyonder to regain his strength would he be augmented, allowing the battle to come to a quick end. Only then would Jason have a chance of being rescued. Upon seeing this, Klein's eyes lit up, and he immediately snapped his fingers. Pa! Boom! In the scarlet lunar corona's trajectory, a pre-buried explosive threw up the soil, blew out a strong impactful gust of wind, and set off a scarlet flame. Being struck by this, the scarlet lunar corona was redirected and landed in another direction. Boom! Another explosive blew up, inducing a fiery light to rise up. Klein leaped up and pounced at the scarlet lunar corona, which wasn't too far from him. Suddenly, a pale palm appeared right in front of the scarlet lunar corona's landing spot and grabbed it. It was none other than Steve, who had disappeared and then reappeared. His instincts made him chase after the full moon. Pa! With a soft sound, Steve grabbed the scarlet lunar corona. His dark green eyes, which were full of malice and desire, gained a trace of spiritual luster. This caused him to return from the form of a pure wraith to a sequence 5 powerhouse. He smirked at Klein. He wasn't in a hurry to deal with this weak opponent, so he let his figure disappear once more. Klein, who had already thrown himself out, rolled twice, reached into his pocket with his left hand, and once again gently flipped open the iron cigarette case. He touched Rosego's all-black eye. Amidst the ravings that caused his tears and snot to constantly flow, Klein saw more strange black lines, and from their origin, he caught a glimpse of the invisible Steve. He was closing in on Sharon, who was slumped to the ground weakly, at high speeds. He wanted to control her, rescue Jason, and put an end to the battle. Sharon was their main target for this operation. Klein suddenly retracted his left hand, and with a thought, he once again injected his spirituality into the Sun Brooch. 2. 1. A holy beam of light descended from the sky, enveloping Sharon from behind. Steve, who was wearing a dark red cloak, suddenly appeared a few meters away, barely avoiding the holy light. With the augmentation of the scarlet lunar corona, his speed was already frightening to the point of him being capable of effectively dodging in an instant. But at the same time, the genuflecting Klein had raised his right hand and pulled the trigger of the revolver. His target was Jason. A resplendent bullet flew out, aimed directly at Jason's back, and was about to help him enter the bronze door of mystery. But at that moment, Steve disappeared and reappeared behind Jason, blocking the bullet with his open left palm. Sizzle! The sunlight from the explosion made him shake his arm in pain. He narrowed his eyes as his skin was constantly charring and peeling, but it quickly healed. Suddenly, he heard a crisp sound. Klein had snapped his fingers again. Boom! A nearby explosive exploded. The resulting shockwave and bullet-like stones shot out in all directions. A large number of them landed on Jason's and Steve's bodies. No! With a blood-curdling scream, the clothes on Jason's side tore apart, and the quickly darkening white spots on his skin appeared as if fresh blood was about to seep out. To a zombie with a body as hard as steel, this wasn't an effective injury, but to a person like Jason who was struggling to hold on, it was equivalent to the beckoning of death. He could no longer hold on as those terrifying arms quickly pulled him into the crack of the bronze door. No! Jason's scream resounded into the distance as the mysterious and illusory door closed with a clang, devouring the rest of his screams and isolating it from the world. The clearing in the middle of the warehouses turned completely silent. Jason had completely disappeared, as though he had never been born into this world. Steve's eyes widened, and he opened his mouth, letting out an angry screech, "Damn it!" Bam! As his voice resounded, Klein felt as if someone had heavily hammered him in the head. His vision turned blurry, and whatever he breathed in smelled of blood. His vision had become blood red. For a short time, his ears were filled with buzzing sounds, and he couldn't hear anything else. After Tyre delivered the scarlet lunar corona, he had grown black fur and sharp fangs. He was no longer immune to its effects and painfully covered his ears. Blood even flowed out from the corner of his eyes and mouth. Merrick, who should have seized the opportunity to grab him, was in an even worse state. His desire and malice, which had been suppressed by the sedative, had reared their heads once more, causing him to almost lose control of his zombies. His expression was extremely twisted. Due to Wraith Steve's shriek, the weakened Miss Sharon also revealed a painful expression. However, she still managed to close her palm with much difficulty, causing the rays of light to be severed, which caused the illusory, mysterious bronze door to disappear. Klein knew that the situation was turning bad. Enduring his headache, he quickly took a step back and entered the fire. His figure quickly disappeared and reappeared in another explosion that happened in a different direction. He had just jumped out, in an attempt to strike back, when he saw Steve, the middle-aged man with the dark red cloak, stop in his tracks instead of chasing after him, as though he was waiting for something. Klein suddenly felt agitated. His head felt dizzy, and his stomach spasmed. He quickly weakened, but he had no idea why. Merrick, who had just recovered from the sharp shriek, also had an abnormal reaction. He constantly stretched out his hands to grab at himself, as if his body suffered an uncontrollable itch. He gasped for breath as he used his long, sharp nails to rip apart his clothes and left white streaks across his body. The more he scratched, the deeper it became, causing its redness to seep out. Sharon fell to the ground, but she couldn't stand again. Her blue eyes lost their focus, as though she couldn't see anything. "Poison." She whispered the word. Not far from her, Steve looked at her tightly clenched fist. He seemed rather fearful of the bronze door that was covered with mysterious patterns and an indescribable smell. He didn't dare to recklessly make a move. In his right hand, he held the scarlet lunar corona, the crimson full moon that was releasing a cold glow. Using his left hand, he took out a brown, translucent glass bottle from his pocket, and he snorted. Biological poison bottle can be used to randomly create different kinds of toxins. As long as you open it, the poisons will gradually spread to its surroundings. It will be effective in less than a minute, and the symptoms will only become worse. In 4 minutes, if you don't leave the poison-filled environment, then the corresponding effects will be unpreventable, such as death. What a pity. I thought Jason would be able to hold on to this moment. Sharon, you wouldn't have been affected since a spirit body isn't afraid of poison, but unfortunately, there's the scarlet lunar corona here, which prevents you from switching states. Perhaps, you can give up resisting and let me understand your hidden charms. He appeared to be leisurely introducing the abilities of the mystical item in his hand, as though he wanted to wait for Klein and company to completely lose their ability to resist before attacking. However, Tyre didn't understand his intention. Under the influence of the scarlet lunar corona, the irrational werewolf started his counterattack without hesitation. He threw himself forward, flailed his claws, and swiped across Merrick's body, tearing it apart. Clang! 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 The sound of nails tearing through steel sounded in succession, and Merrick's skin finally showed signs of bloody wounds. Klein pinched his forehead. It felt like his forehead was starting to heat up, but the negative effects weren't as bad as what Steve mentioned. It seems like the poison has been weakened by the Sun Brooch's constant purification and purging effect. Klein suddenly sneered. Are you planning on attacking us after we succumb to the poison? Why do you think I didn't use fireworks just now? Why do you think I relied on explosives? With so many explosions, I've definitely attracted the attention of others. The official Beyonders nearby are rushing here at this very moment. You don't have much time left. Steve turned his head to look at Klein, whose face couldn't be identified thanks to the paint that was smeared on it. He suddenly laughed and said, I forgot there's a bug that I can easily deal with. Don't worry, you'll definitely be dead before the people from the church arrive. Before he could finish his sentence, Klein suddenly raised the revolver in his right hand and shot out a purifying bullet. Steve moved his footsteps slightly, traversing several meters in turn. Along the way, he left afterimages behind. However, Klein's bullet didn't hit where he had aimed. Instead, it hit the middle of the clearing, piercing through the soil, and creating a loud commotion. A breeze of spirituality blew past, and both Merrick's zombie and Steve's shadow stopped moving at the same time. In a split second, they charged out rapidly, charging towards the center of the clearing like a pack of hungry dogs at mealtime. Steve, who was about to use arcane methods to control Klein and easily kill him, was stunned for a moment. Then, he revealed a puzzled and surprised expression. For some baffling reason, he discovered that he couldn't command the undead he controlled. It was a first for him. At the same time, Klein snapped his fingers, detonating a few more bombs and setting off scarlet flames that soared into the air in different locations. His figure leaped from one bonfire to the other as he blinked towards the clearing's exterior. You want to run? Steve whispered. Just as he was about to turn incorporeal to chase after his target, he found that the zombies and shadows had dug out a square metal box and were fighting for the item inside. Soon, one of Shadow succeeded. Its body swelled, and seemingly gaining intelligence, it flew in another direction. So that item is used to delay my actions and allow him to successfully escape. Humph, he still doesn't understand what a wraith and the Scarlet Lunar Corona is capable of. Steve temporarily gave up on chasing Klein. Putting away the biological poison bottle, his body suddenly disappeared and appeared on a thin layer of ice that formed in a puddle of water. He relied on his terrifying speed to drag out an afterimage and arrived behind that giant shadow. Steve's eyes flashed with a dark green light. The shadow instantly dispersed without a sound, and the item in its hand dropped. The other zombies and shadows, completely disregarding the oppressive aura of the mighty existence as they rushed over to grab it. Steve was more and more alarmed and curious. He discovered that his spiritual intuition couldn't draw any revelations from the object that had caused the rioting of the zombies and shadows. He stepped forward and grabbed the object with his left hand. It was a dark gold key ring. Hanging from it was an ancient and exquisite copper whistle. Beside the copper whistle hung a simple bronze key. They clung closely together as they remained in Steve's pale palm. At the same time, Steve's Scarlet Lunar Corona in his right hand was quietly emanating a crimson glow, like a miniature full moon. Before thoughts even surfaced in Steve's mind, a faint but very strange sound entered his mind, ripping at his nerves and scraping his scalp. Ah! Steve let out a miserable scream and fell from midair to the ground. The Scarlet Lunar Corona, which he held in his hand, and the key ring with the copper whistle and key were sent flying at the same time. He struggled and twisted on the spot, his body bulging and protruding. There were arms that were as small as babies which grew out of his body, or a foul, light yellow liquid that sloshed inside his body. At this moment, a flame ignited again. Klein, who had escaped, leaped out and appeared in the path of the Scarlet Lunar Corona. He didn't attempt to catch the mystical item. Instead, with a gentle flick, he diverted its trajectory, sending it flying toward the weakened Miss Sharon. Steve's cries of pain gradually died down, and the Scarlet Lunar Corona accurately landed on Sharon. Sharon's figure instantly turned incorporeal, and the blue eyes that had lost their focus regained their luster. Clenching her right hand tightly, her left hand held the palm-sized accessory inlaid with a ring of dark rubies. her body began to float. The scarlet lunar corona allowed its wielder to be immune to the influence of the full moon. Sharon was no longer weak. And in her spirit-body state, she wasn't afraid of the biological poison. At this moment, the zombies and shadows gathered together once again, fighting over the chained master key and Azek's copper whistle. Klein didn't care. He raised his left arm and pointed. The sun brooch on his chest flashed a dark golden glow and disappeared. An intense, bright, and holy light fell from the sky, shrouding the group of zombies and shadows that were fighting over it. In what seemed like daylight, the transparent and bizarre shadows quickly melted and disappeared. The pale and stinking corpses emitted black smoke first before they ignited and burned like candles. By the time the light disappeared, there was almost nothing left except for Azek's ancient and intricate copper whistle and the master key, which were both strung on an already blackened key ring. They lay there silently. Meanwhile, Sharon didn't care about Merrick, whose injuries were turning graver thanks to Tyre's attacks. Instead, she relied on her own ability to phase into mirror-like items to reach the thin piece of ice that Steve had previously used, and stepped out. She stretched out her right hand towards Steve, who was transforming into a monster, and opened it wide, aiming the palm of her hand at the enemy. Endless rays of light burst out and quickly intertwined to form the mysterious patterned bronze door. Creak! With a jarring noise, the small black hat on Sharon's head was blown away by a sudden gust of wind, and her carefully combed blonde hair cascaded down in a disheveled state. It was obvious that using the mystical item again was rather taxing on her. Creak! The mysterious bronze door produced a crack, and a series of shrill laughter, sobbing, and shouting echoed in the air. Arms either filled with teeth or completely without skin reached out wildly and grabbed at Steve, whose pustules were bursting one by one. The strange dark green vines that accentuated an infant's face and the slippery, illusory tentacles also bound the Sequence 5 powerhouse. Ah! Steve cried out again. The pale yellow pus, which flowed out, covered his entire body, allowing him to barely resist the pull. A bright red crack appeared on his face, and in it was a hole leading to a dark tunnel. At that moment, Klein raised his revolver and aimed it at him. Without any delay or hesitation, with his face disguised, Klein calmly pulled the trigger while wearing his half-top hat. Bang! Bang! With a flash of the sun brooch, 2 bullets filled with holiness accurately hit Steve in the head. Although they didn't pierce his skin or bones, they ignited resplendent flames, turning Steve into a bright torch. Ah! With another scream, Steve was pulled closer to the illusory bronze door. As Klein released the revolver's cylinder, the shells fell to the ground, and he took out the metal box containing the Beyonder bullets. At the same time, he once again injected his spirituality into the sun brooch. 2. 1. A pure and flawless pillar of light fell from the sky and instantly hit Steve's body. Taking this breather, Klein inserted 3 purifying bullets and 3 exorcism bullets into the cylinder and snapped it shut. He aimed at Steve's head again, and with the flash of the dark golden brooch, he pulled the trigger hard, 6 times in a row. Bang! 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 One by one, the bullets sliced through the air, either swirling with a golden luster or emitting resplendent beams, as they hit Steve's head. Thanks to a clown's control over his body and his persistence in practicing his marksmanship, Klein's 6 bullets, which were augmented with cleave of purification, accurately hit the same spot as the first 2 bullets. They were like fists from a giant of light, repeatedly pounding at the left of Steve's face. With a series of bangs, Steve, who had been entangled by the strange arms and the dark green vines, failed to phase away to avoid the attack. His head was whipped to the side repeatedly as his body trembled. His cheekbones quickly caved in, breaking out into sharp white bones. Bang! The last bullet completely tore through, splashing the Sequence 5 powerhouse's dark red blood. This opening allowed the resplendent and golden flames to continuously drill in, burning into bursts of dark green mist. In the holy light, Steve's clothes were ignited. His body was quickly charred as he dripped with grease. However, he was still alive. Compared to Nimblewright Master Rosago, the survivability of a Sequence 5 from the mutant pathway was clearly much better. However, the heavily injured Steve could no longer resist the strange tugging arms. His legs moved forward uncontrollably, almost flying towards that bronze door and into the deep crack that had opened. He was thrown into the darkness where pairs of eyes lurked. At this moment, Sharon suddenly clenched her right hand, her forehead covered in sweat. The illusory and subtle rays of light were abruptly severed, and the indescribably mysterious bronze door lost the source of its existence. It swayed, and before Steve entered, it reluctantly pulled back its long arms which were either filled with teeth or blood and sealed the crack. Creak. The door closed, quickly becoming transparent before it disappeared. Steve's leaning body was rigid in place, blackened, and shriveled, like a mummified corpse that had been burned for a long time. With her right fist tightly clenched and the scarlet lunar corona on her, Sharon's figure rapidly turned incorporeal. She took a step forward and overlapped with Steve. Klein's spirit vision instantly lost sight of her. However, the charred Steve raised his fists and abruptly smashed them against his already severely injured head. Bam! His head turned into a pulp like that of a rotten tomato, and milky white spots sprayed out before splattering to the ground. A translucent figure was also expelled. It rapidly spread out, turning into something that looked like a giant jellyfish. Within it was a dreamlike liquid that was swishing and a pair of deathly pale eyes that were condensing. Sharon was forced out by this strange object, and she reappeared beside it. She suddenly stretched out her left hand, letting out a silent shriek. The ground suddenly turned black, as if it had turned into a muddy deep sea. Twisted bloody vines grew out from it, splitting into many sections, with each section having 4 sharp teeth and an eye. The blood-red vine wildly grew upwards, immediately locking onto the jellyfish-like phantom as it greedily sucked the dreamlike liquid within. The phantom quickly collapsed, and the blood-red vine once again retreated back into the muddy deep sea. But with this delay, the headless, charred Steve began running. He tore across the clearing and headed for the way out. He still wasn't dead despite already losing his head. Steve had only run a few steps when a sudden crisp sound cracked in the silence. Pa! Klein, in a black double-breasted frock coat with a matching half-top hat, turned to him and snapped his fingers. Boom! The dirt beneath Steve's feet was violently lifted, and scarlet flames soared. It spread upward, and when it reached its highest point, it spilled down like beautiful fireworks. Steve's body was torn to pieces from such fireworks. His charred hands, feet, guts, and blood splattered everywhere. One of his fingers rolled to Klein's feet, and the brown, translucent biological poison bottle fell in another direction. The mutilated body, which was the last traces of Steve's existence, squirmed a few times before finally becoming still. In the scene with the blooming fireworks, Klein felt his spirituality become more active, and the powers that still wasn't completely his had become more attuned to him. In response to this sensation, he passed the revolver to his left hand. He took off the silk half-top hat from his head with his black-gloved right hand, and he pressed it to his chest, and bowed slightly at Sharon. Sharon's blue eyes looked over. She looked past Klein to the carnage of Werewolf Tyre and Merrick. Sharon's figure disappeared, and Tyre's eyes reflected her image. Tyre stood there stiffly, his black hair standing on end. He raised his arms with great difficulty and pressed them against his head. Gotcha! He twisted hard, and his eyes soon saw his spine which were underneath the cover of his torn clothes. Pa! Tyre twisted and pulled again, pulling his head out of his torso. Throughout the entire process, he didn't let out a single scream or a single word. He held his head, letting the blood constantly drip down. The corpse which had lost its head was still standing straight, without toppling. Sharon didn't immediately leave Tyre's body. She appeared to be attempting something. Very soon, bits of dark green light emerged from Tyre's head and body, quickly condensing onto one of his fangs as its core. It seems like Miss Sharon has a way of accelerating the separation of a beyonder characteristic. The prerequisite to doing so requires her to possess the target, kill the person, and have complete control of the body. Enlightened, Klein bent down and picked up the shells that had fallen to the ground, stuffing them into the metal square box, one by one. He was afraid that the investigators, which would subsequently arrive, would find the artisan through the uniqueness of the shells and, hence, find the woman who had purchased the Briber and Barbarian formulas from him. Then, they would lock onto Eye of Wisdom's gathering, causing his safety to be threatened. As for the bullets, they had long been sacrificed to the corresponding deities in the holy light and flames, just like the materials and charms. Putting the revolver away, Klein was about to take a step forward when Sharon appeared beside the biological poison bottle with an exaggerated speed. She made it float up and land on her palm. Before Klein could think of anything else, the pale woman flicked her wrist and threw him a translucent brown bottle and a dark green fong. To save time, she's helping me pick up my spoils? Klein was startled. He instinctively pulled out a piece of paper and covered the two items. He didn't come into direct contact with them. At this moment, he could see that Sharon's complicated black regal dress had lost its usual tidiness and cleanliness. It fluttered gently in the wind, and a few strands of her light blonde hair were stuck to the side of her face, making her feel more like a person. This biological poison bottle comes with its own lid. I just wonder what negative side effects it has. Klein lowered his head and examined his spoils of war. He used the black cap hanging on the side to reseal the biological poison bottle so that it wouldn't continue to do him harm. As for the dark green fong, it was the Beyonder characteristic left behind by Werewolf Tire. As Klein placed the two items into a small metal box he prepared, and he used holy night powder to create a wall of spirituality, blocking off the influence they had on their surroundings. He watched Sharon's figure disappear from the corner of his eyes. Steve's remnant flesh squirmed and produced a nearly translucent point of light. Similarly, he was still on guard against Merrick, lest he suddenly went crazy. Amidst this vigilance, he discovered that the healing powers of a zombie was truly astonishing. The bone-deep wounds from a moment ago had now basically closed. Merrick also gave him a profound look. It was as though he had remembered something and understood something. When he was done, Klein walked a dozen steps away, picking up the square metal box that had been dug up by the zombies and shadows. Then, he found Azek's copper whistle and the master key, which were surrounded by human-shaped candles. He glanced at it and awkwardly realized that he didn't dare to pick them up. The effects of the scarlet lunar corona were still radiating through the clearing. This was the last trap he had set up, one that would never be used unless all other means were exhausted. For this, he had taken the time to visit a hospital's morgue and test out what the corpses would do after they had gotten their hands on Azek's copper whistle. It allowed him to design a corresponding plan. Ahem. Can you stop the influence of the scarlet lunar corona? Klein turned to look at Sharon, who had materialized again. She already had an additional translucent doll in her hand. Without saying a word, Sharon placed the scarlet lunar corona to her chest with her other hand. The circle of rubies quickly dimmed, and the light from the full moon disappeared from the abandoned land. Only then did Klein lean over and grab the keyring with his fingertip, raising up Azek's copper whistle and the master key. Then, he stored them in the square iron box with concave bullet marks and quickly created a seal. Meanwhile, Merrick circled around and dealt with the scene. Sharon pulled up her small black bonnet, and her figure disappeared before reappearing in front of Klein. The Book of Secrets is in your room, Sharon said calmly. That is to say, no matter what the end result is, as long as I can make it back alive, I will be able to get a portion of the reward. I wouldn't have gone through all this trouble for nothing. Klein smiled and bowed. Thank you for your generosity. The official Beyonders will arrive any time soon. We have to leave. Sharon nodded and asked, Do you need any help? There's no need. Klein chuckled. I still have lots of fireworks which I haven't released. As soon as he finished his sentence, he raised his hand and snapped his fingers. Boom. 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 The remaining explosives exploded, one by one, sending flames up into the sky. They clustered around the largest and most eye-catching one in the center, producing a dreamy and beautiful scene. Sharon's gaze was instinctively attracted to it for a second, and when she looked back, Klein was no longer there. There was only a spark that gradually dissipated. Away from the clearing, he took a small detour northwest, preventing him from running into any official Beyonders on the way. One match after another was lit on the road, and the flames quickly soared up and then quickly disappeared. Klein's figure constantly emerged from within them as he leaped across the flames and departed the West Balham dock. Immediately following that, he took out a special bottle of extract and wiped it over his face. With a gentle wipe using a piece of paper, he removed all the paint. Pah! Klein shook his wrist and burned the paper to ashes. Then, he picked up the cane he had hidden nearby, straightened his clothes, and walked out into the street like an ordinary person. Not long after, Klein arrived at a cathedral. Its name was Lever Cathedral. As many devotees weren't rich, they might not be able to rest on Sundays and were usually busy during the day. Thus, the cathedrals of the various churches typically opened until the early hours of the morning, giving most believers the opportunity to pray and repent. Klein looked up, tapped the steps with the black cane in his hand, and stepped inside. He intended to avoid the subsequent round of inspections of the surroundings people. A few minutes later, a machinery hive mind team appeared at the clearing surrounded by abandoned warehouses. There were a total of 5 of them, each armed with different kinds of Beyonder weapons. However, all of them frowned when they saw the cleaned-up scene. After looking for a moment, they began putting in effort to gather clues. Lever Cathedral. Since it wasn't even 11 yet, there were quite a few people here. However, not a single person spoke. The entire prayer hall was so peaceful and holy that no one wanted to break the silence. Klein sat in the third pew along the aisle. He leaned his black cane forward and took off his silk half-top hat. Wearing a black double-breasted frock coat, he clasped his hands against his lower jaw and closed his eyes. His expression was abnormally calm as he faced the triangle-shaped sacred emblem in front of him. After a full half-hour of uninterrupted silence, Klein opened his eyes and slowly rose to his feet. He took his cane, put on his hat, and left the cathedral, taking a rental carriage back to Minsk Street in the dark. At this moment, the vigilance and surveillance of the surrounding area had inevitably relaxed, turning into the shadows under the light of the gas lamps. Shortly after midnight, Klein took out his key, opened the door to his house, and entered the empty guest rooms to search for the Book of Secrets. It didn't take him much effort to find the old book, bound in thick goatskin, in the wardrobe in a room on the first floor. The hardcover of the book was dark black, with 2 lines of Hermes written in crimson. Book of Secrets. Klarman. Phew. Klein exhaled but was in no rush to read the book. Instead, he quickly constructed a wall of spirituality in the room, summoning and responding to himself via a ritual, and then he threw Azek's copper whistle, the master key, the all-black eye, the Beyonder bullets, the bottle of biological poison, the werewolf Beyonder characteristic, the Book of Secrets, and even all the vessels above the gray fog. He planned on waiting for the commotion to subside before deciding on which to take out and which to carry. After doing all this, he didn't even bother to study the werewolf Beyonder characteristic or the bottle of biological poison. He simply washed up and laid in bed. There were 2 reasons for doing so. Firstly, reading the book was too time-consuming. It was very easy to bring trouble to his body in the real world on this rather uncalm night. Secondly, Klein was aware of his current weakness, which was that the speed at which his spirituality was growing wasn't enough to satisfy his ever-increasing Beyonder powers and mystical items. After such an intense battle, his spirituality was already drained. His head was aching, and he was drowsy. Yes, the one thing that places the greatest burden on my spirituality are the paper figurine substitutes, followed by the creation of Sun Holy Water with the Sun Brooch, but it wasn't used tonight. Next in the list is Holy Water Creation and Flaming Jump. Klein yawned and used cogitation to get rid of the state of extreme tiredness and tenseness that prevented him from falling asleep. In less than 10 seconds, he entered the land of dreams as various fragmented scenes appeared alternately before him. In the clearing surrounded by the abandoned warehouses, the machinery hive mind came and went before coming again. The person in charge of investigating this incident went from being a team captain to an expert at the rank of deacon. Xianxia Bernard's brown hair remained unkempt and stuck out stubbornly, making it impossible to hide them even with a hat on. This led to many members of the machinery hive mind to secretly joke that the deacon probably used a balm to style his hair. At this moment, Xianxia, with his cut jaw and facial features, was holding a silver mirror with ancient patterns on it. On each side of the mirror was an eye-like ornament. They were built on the foundation of a black gem which looked serene and charming. Xianxia surveyed the area and said, although the rats in the sewers are experts at interfering with divination and mediumship and had already dealt with the scene effectively, this is a mysterious beyonder world, and there is no way to guarantee a 100% success. As he spoke, he looked at the silver mirror in his hand as he used his right hand to touch its surface thrice. After pausing for 2 seconds, Xianxia took a deep breath and said in a deep voice, "Respected Arodes, my question is, who were the participants in the incident that just happened here?" The surrounding darkness suddenly thickened, and the surface of the silver mirror began to ripple with aqueous light. Soon, a scene appeared in the silver mirror. Amidst the rising flames, there was a figure floating in the air. He was wearing a black double-breasted frock coat and a half-top hat. His body was distorted, and his face was indistinct. Furthermore, his face was smeared with paint. Beneath his feet, flames rose up and engulfed him. As the aqueous light flashed, the scene changed. A middle-aged man in a dark red cloak appeared. His arm was burning with resplendent flames, but his head was hidden in the darkness. Scene after scene was played out in front of their eyes. They saw a woman with a complicated black regal dress and messy blonde hair. However, her face was completely transparent, as if she didn't exist. Beside this lady were 2 men with black fur all over their bodies. Only their backs could be seen as they were being pulled by strange arms. Finally, the changes came to an end as it fixed onto the blazing flames that soared into the sky. The fireworks bloomed in a splendid and resplendent fashion as they lit up the entire scene. In this dreamlike scene, the man in the black double-breasted frock coat appeared once again. Twisting and retracting, he faced forward, pressed his hat to his chest, and bowed slightly. Not only was his face extremely blurry after being interfered with, but it also presented a glisten of oil. Just as Xianxia was about to ask his teammates for their opinions, several lines of text in ancient Fasak appeared on the surface of the mirror. Based on the principle of reciprocity, it's my turn to ask the question. If you answer wrong or lie, you will be punished. The word punished was blood red, as if it were dripping with liquid. The expression on Xianxia's face was twisted at first before it turned abnormally serious. Soon after, the mirror's aqueous light flashed and a new line of text appeared. What's your sexual orientation? Xianxia was stunned as he felt the gazes of his surrounding team members all land on him. 6 in the morning. The sky was just beginning to brighten. The sleeping Klein awoke to the punctual church bells. According to his usual habits, he would just turn around and continue sleeping until it was almost 8 o'clock. But this time, he immediately sat up and looked around. Yeah, I didn't get raided on the pretext of checking my gas meter. He let out a sigh of relief, and without even bothering to clean himself, he got off the bed and took 4 steps counterclockwise to go above the gray fog. He wanted to study his spoils from last night. Sitting in the full seat, Klein started from the simplest. He picked up the dark green fong and observed it for a few seconds. Then, he conjured a pen and paper and wrote the divination sentence, its effects. This didn't mean that divination could be used as a substitute for experimentation. With the fact that he held the item in his possession, and how he knew a lot about prisoner, lunatic, and werewolf from Sharon and Merrick, he believed that it was enough for him to attempt to gain some revelations from it. After reciting the statement, he quickly entered the dreamland and witnessed one scene after another. A vicious wound appeared on Werewolf Tyre's stomach, and his intestines flowed out as they were dragged across the ground. However, he only washed it with water and stuffed the intestines back into his stomach. He pinched both sides of the wound, and in the end, the wound actually healed. Under the perfect red moon, he faced the sky and let out a long howl. Black fur grew out of his body, inch by inch, and the fangs in his mouth were distinct. He waved his claws and cracked the steel plate that wasn't considered thin. He ran wildly through the wilderness, increasing the gap between him and the group of pursuing gray wolves as he ran further and further away. He made the attendants, whose eyes were glazed but cold, charge at their enemies without fear of death. He also used a variety of weapons to kill people, including bombs, and he became stronger as he lost his reasoning while in his enraged state. Opening his eyes, Klein roughly understood the characteristics of a werewolf and grasped the hidden dangers of this beyonder characteristic. Werewolf Tyre had been under the full moon's illumination, allowing him to be unrestrained towards his desires. After his death, he left a relatively strong spiritual mark, so those beyonders, who would use this beyonder characteristic to concoct a potion to advance themselves to the next sequence, had to resist this kind of effect at an early stage, otherwise, they would show signs of losing control. However, the negative effects had yet to reach the level of a sealed artifact, and the beyonder characteristic left behind by the werewolf could still be used as the main ingredient for a potion. That's good. Unfortunately, Zombie Jason's beyonder characteristic has been swallowed by that strange door. I wonder where it leads to and if there's a way to get it back. Klein put down the dark green fong, feeling both regret and sadness for his loss, before picking up the bottom of brown translucent biological poison. He repeated the same procedure and performed a dream divination, but this time he didn't have the confidence to gain a detailed revelation. Therefore, he changed the divination statement to its positive and negative effects. In the gray gloom of the dream world, Klein once again saw tragic scenes. Someone fell to the ground, scratching himself and ripping off his skin, flesh, and even bones. Another person held his head, his eyes losing focus while his auras weakened. One kept vomiting. Towards the end, the person who died was convulsing. Someone burst out laughing so hard that he couldn't even breathe. Some people stopped fighting and looked at each other. Then, they hugged and kissed each other. When the scene reached the end, the translucent brown bottle was placed into a cup with water. The transparent liquid inside gradually turned amber in color and was drunk. The person holding on to the bottle of biological poison was weakened at first before coughing. Then, he touched his forehead. He found himself scalding as his condition turned for the worse. The dream quickly ended. Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the long table as he attempted to interpret the revelation with great difficulty. According to Steve, the earlier revelations mean that after the biological poison's bottle lid is removed, it would keep emanating its poison. As for which poison the opponents gets inflicted by, it's completely random, and even the wielder is unable to control it. The poison inside is really quite abominable. The effective range of the poison cannot be deciphered via a revelation. Soaking it in water and drinking the amber liquid in advance would prevent one from getting poisoned? But how many minutes should the soaking take? Even if the person holding the biological poison bottle doesn't open the lid, their bodies would get worse as they slowly get infected, and the ailments become serious? What's the exact cutoff time? Klein rubbed his forehead, intending to do some experiments above the gray fog when he was free, but he didn't know if the biological poison bottle was effective in there. For example, in his current spirit body state, he wasn't afraid of being poisoned at all. I'll leave it at this. I'll study it in detail in the future. Klein turned his attention to the Book of Secrets, which was bound in goatskin. He then casually flipped to the first page. It was a title page with simple patterns on it but with nothing written on it. Flipping another page, Klein finally saw the opening line of the Book of Secrets: "We worship the moon, not the evernight goddess." Another statement about only worshipping the moon and not the goddess? Klein couldn't help but have a look of contemplation. The last time he heard about such matters was when he was learning about the life school of thought. He never expected that the shaman king, who had lived his entire life in the southern continent, would also have a similar point of view. In the Pale Era, at the end of the fourth epoch, the Berserk Sea became a veritable reality. Thus, the northern and southern continent were cut off from each other, and the life school of thought was formed in the early fifth epoch. Obviously, it was impossible for the life school of thought to extend itself to the southern continent before Roselle sent his men to find a safe sea route. Shaman King Klarman was a historical figure who was active in an era more than 1,000 years before the northern continent's invasion. In other words, the two Beyonder factions, which were in different continents, had no way of communicating with each other and had chosen to worship the moon itself and ignore the Evernight goddess at almost the same period of time. Such a coincidence inadvertently made one consider why. Could it be that the birth of a new god had taken away a portion of the authority related to the moon? But, as a deity, he shouldn't be so obscure and unknown. In other words, although the goddess had snatched the authority of the moon, the followers of the primordial moon god had survived. They had been passed down from the fourth epoch or even the third epoch. Even after the separation of the northern continent and southern continent, they blossomed into two groups, one helmed by the Shaman King, the other by the life school of thought. Klein made a rough guess, but he was troubled by the lack of clues to narrow the scope. He gave up thinking about it for the time being and quickly skimmed through the rest of the contents of the Book of Secrets. In the preamble, Shaman King Klarman said, very directly, that many of the rituals, deeds, astromancy, and summoning techniques in the book had originated from a primitive worship of the moon and described the corresponding honorific names in detail: the one and only red moon, the symbol of life and beauty, the mother of all spiritual forces. There's actually an honorable name. However, it lacks the more popular descriptions like those of the Evernight goddess or Mother Earth. If there really is such a hidden god, his followers would inevitably develop a simpler title to address him that's more suitable for praise than the worship of the primitive moon. Klein sensed something amiss as he began to analyze it with his own knowledge on mysticism. Besides, using the Lady of Crimson to hold a ritual would very obviously direct it at the goddess. But using an honorable name which is very similar but more detailed would circumvent the goddess, pointing it to the source of their power, the primitive moon. I wonder what arcane existence it is. Klein thought with wonder and alarm. Due to his lack of time, he skimmed through the details and found that, as Shaman King Klarman had said so himself, many of the deeds and rituals were directed at the moon. For Klein, it wasn't a cause for concern. He didn't plan on copying them wholesale and end up provoking the primitive moon which he had no idea about. What he wanted to learn was the overall structure, design, and details of the deeds and rituals. Only by mastering the underlying rules could he come up with his own secret deeds, rituals, astromancy, and summoning techniques that pointed to the King of Yellow and Black. Perhaps in the far future, I'll have my own mysticism system. Klein removed the spirit pendulum from his wrist and finally confirmed the authenticity of the Book of Secrets. After receiving a clear answer, he was in no hurry to use the werewolf's Beyonder characteristic to divine a formula. After all, he wasn't able to sell it, and for the same reason, he decided to delay the research of the biological poison bottle for a while. He quickly returned to the real world and drew the curtains. He saw the sun, which wasn't capable of illuminating the land. It was hidden behind the clouds and fog, looking somewhat pale. Achoo! Suddenly, Klein covered his nose and mouth, and he sneezed. Only then did he realize that his head was aching and burning. He felt lightheaded and had seemingly caught a cold. I actually fell ill as a Sequence 7 Beyonder. Klein pulled out a piece of paper and sniffed. He carefully thought back for a moment and quickly understood the reason. The negative effects of the biological poison bottle would gradually weaken the possessor and result in an illness. If it was carried around even longer, then it might even lead to death. And this effect couldn't be eliminated with the use of spirituality seals. Last night, Klein's spirituality was almost nearly emptied after the battle. While his body was still weak from the poison, he still carried the biological poison bottle with him and hid in Lever Cathedral for half an hour. Adding the time spent on his return to Minsk Street, and he had embarrassingly fallen ill. Thankfully, it's not serious. It doesn't affect anything. Klein sneezed again as he prepared to soak himself in a hot bath. After washing his face and rinsing his mouth, he specially fried an egg to reward himself. The fragrance was truly tantalizing. A Shaman King's Book of Secrets and the biological poison bottle, a mystical item that's not worse than the Sun Brooch, as well as a sequence 7 werewolf's Beyonder characteristic. I made quite a killing this time. It's just a pity that I didn't manage to obtain the zombie Beyonder characteristic. Klein sat by the side of the dining table. As he ate, he did a tally of his spoils. What made his heart ache was the fact that he had used a total of 11 Beyonder bullets, each worth nearly 10 pounds. That is to say, I burned 100 pounds. It's really like throwing money to deal damage. It's no wonder most low and mid-sequence Beyonders are so desperate for money. Klein glanced down at his breakfast. They added up to only a few pence. After breakfast, Klein idly read the newspapers, sneezing from time to time as he wiped his nose and mouth with a piece of tissue paper. As soon as the church bell stopped chiming at 8 o'clock, his doorbell rang. Klein wasn't surprised to see the reporter for the Daily Observer, Mike Joseph. The reporter with beautiful blue eyes and a thin mustache, but with rather rough skin, took off his hat and greeted him. Then he went straight to the point. "Detective Moriarty, do you have time to take the job?" Although he had a cold, he still needed to take on jobs like usual to avoid suspicion from anyone during this period of time. Klein, who had just finished a job, smiled and said, "I'm slightly ill, but that doesn't affect my fighting or shooting skills." Mike suddenly smiled and said, "Thank you for your help. Let's set off now." Detective Moriarty, have you had breakfast?" "I'll treat you. As your employer, I should be in charge of providing you your meals today." "Inviting me to breakfast?" Klein was startled. "I just finished eating. But I suggest you go to East Borough to have breakfast there. That way, you can see a lot of things." "I'll just need a cup of coffee when we're there." "No problem." Mike pointed outside. "The carriage I hired is waiting." Klein sized him up and said, "Sir, you'd better change into something a little worse, otherwise, there will be lots of work for me." Mike looked down at his tweed coat and said with some realization, "This is too eye-catching." "It is in East Borough." Klein pointed into his place. "I have some specially prepared clothes." We are about the same size." Mike couldn't help but exclaim, "You really are a professional." "Professional criminal?" Klein lampooned. After changing into ordinary workers' clothes, the two boarded the carriage and headed for the outskirts of East Borough. "Achoo!" Klein pulled out another piece of tissue paper, wiped his mouth and nose, and blew his nose. Since there was no trash can nearby, he folded the tissue paper properly and stuffed it back into his pocket. "The food in this coffee shop is okay. Of course, this is relative to the residents of East Borough." Klein pointed to the slightly greasy coffee shop at the corner of the street. He occasionally came here for breakfast whenever he spent the night at his one-bedroom apartment that was nearby. "Looks like it's a pretty good restaurant." Mike didn't think it was a coffee shop. It was already past 9 o'clock, and there were very few customers in the coffee shop. East Borough residents typically finished their breakfast at around 7 and began to work or to look for work. After accompanying Mike as he ordered stewed beef with potatoes, bread, and coffee, Klein looked around for a window seat. At that moment, he saw an acquaintance, the elderly man he had helped while pretending to be a journalist. "He was the one who brought me here in the first place. Why is he only having breakfast now?" As Klein thought, he turned to Mike and said, "You have an interviewee." As he spoke, he carried his coffee cup to the tramp. The man was wearing the same thick jacket as before. His grizzled hair was oily, and his beard was obvious. However, he no longer looked tired, and his face was no longer as appallingly pale as before. "Good morning, we meet again." Klein sat down across him and greeted him, noticing that his breakfast was black bread with a large cup of cheap tea that was worth a penny. The elderly man raised his head, took a close look, and said in pleasant surprise, "Mr. Reporter, it's you?" Klein laughed dryly, pointed at Mike and said, "This is my colleague, he wants to do a deeper investigation on my previous interview." Being an experienced and knowledgeable reporter, Mike didn't say anything further when he heard that. All he did was nod with a smile and greeted the elderly man. As for the matter of Detective Moriarty pretending to be a reporter, it wasn't like he had only found out about it today. He was the one who had lent him his fake reporter's identification. "So you really are a reporter?" the elderly man blurted out in astonishment. "But that doesn't stop you from being a kind-hearted person." Klein smiled and asked, "How have you been recently?" The elderly man drank a mouthful of tea and said, "Thanks to your help, I finally had a good night's sleep and ate my fill, so I wasn't that weak. My original plan was to go back to my original job, making shoes, but they didn't want me. They said." My hand shook. He lowered his head and chuckled, skipping that episode. "Later, I went down to the docks and found some work. It was tiring, but at least I made money. I've already rented a spot in someone's house for only 6.5 pence a week. Of course, I can only sleep there at night. Well, that's how working at the dock is like. I went early today and ate nothing. I raised my hand and shouted my name and the supervisor's name, but I wasn't chosen, so I had to come back here. Fortunately, there's still a chance in the afternoon. Those people in the morning might be busy till late and won't be fighting against us for those jobs." Klein listened quietly, occasionally taking a sip of the bad coffee. As for Mike, he took out a pen and paper and quickly made notes. 3:53 today is quite different from yesterday plus, turn off reset. Finally, the elderly man, with gray hair by his temples, took a sip of tea and sighed with a smile. "In truth, this is already much better than my previous situation, and it's much better than many of the people here. For instance." He pointed out the window to the tramps huddled in a corner. Klein and Mike looked over and saw a group of cowering tramps lying on the ground in a filthy place that provided shelter from the wind. They were of all sexes and ages. It was possible for them to never wake up again in the coldness of late autumn. It was then that Klein noticed an old woman in her 60s standing by the street. Her dress was old and worn, but she was relatively neat, and her hair was neatly trimmed. The white-haired old lady had the usual tired look of a tramp, but she still persisted in not squeezing together with the group. Instead, she slowly walked by the roadside, occasionally gazing into the coffee shop numbly. "She's also a pitiful person." The former tramp who had eaten the leftover black bread also noticed the old lady and sighed. She was said to have led quite a good life in the past. Her husband was a grain merchant and had a very spirited child, but unfortunately, he went bankrupt and her husband and child died not long after. "She's different from us, really, and you can tell at a glance. Sigh, she won't be able to hold on much longer, unless she's lucky to be admitted into the workhouse every time." As he listened, Mike's expression changed from quiet to somber. He slowly let out a sigh and said, "I want to interview her. Can you invite her for me? She can eat and drink whatever she wants here." The man wasn't surprised by this request. He merely looked at Klein and Mike separately, as if to say, "The both of you are indeed colleagues. Yes, I'm sure she would like that." He drank his tea, got up, and walked out of the greasy coffee shop. Not long after, the elderly woman in her old but tidy dress followed him in. Her pale face slightly lightened thanks to the warmth of the coffee shop. She continued to tremble, as if she wanted to release the coldness in her body, bit by bit, and absorb the relatively high temperature within the coffee shop. Even after she sat down on the chair, it still took her a full minute before she could truly warm up. "You can order whatever you want. This is the reward for accepting this interview," Klein spoke on Mike's behalf. After Mike nodded, the old lady modestly ordered toast, low-quality cream, and coffee. Then she smiled and said, "I heard that one cannot eat greasy food after not having eaten in a while. Very polite, very self-restrained, not like a tramp at all." Klein sighed silently. Before the food arrived, Mike asked casually, "Can you talk about how you became a tramp?" The old lady revealed a look of reminiscence and said with a bitter smile, "My husband was a grain merchant who mainly bought all kinds of grain from domestic farmers, but we rapidly went bankrupt ever since the Grain Act was repealed. He wasn't very young to begin with. After suffering that setback, his body quickly collapsed. Not long after, he passed away. My child, a brilliant young man, had been learning the ropes of doing business from his father. He couldn't suffer the blow, and he ended up jumping into the Tussock River on a moonless night. His first suicide didn't work, He was sent to the magistrate's court, and the police and judges were very impatient, feeling that he was wasting their time. If you want to commit suicide, please do so quietly and successfully. Don't trouble us. Yes, that was probably what they wanted to say, but they found it too direct. My child was put in prison. Not long after, he committed suicide for the second time and succeeded. The old lady spoke very calmly, as though it wasn't something that had happened to her. But for some reason, Klein felt a deep sense of sorrow. Nothing is more lamentable than a dead heart. He suddenly recalled the saying he had heard in his previous life. In this world, suicide was not only prohibited by the churches, but it was a punishable crime. As for the reason, Klein knew very well why. First of all, many suicides were committed by jumping into a river, and without being discovered in time, there was a certain probability of them turning into a water ghost. Second, the suicider often had very abnormal emotions. Thus, under such states, ending their lives was equivalent to a sacrificial offering which could resonate with particular strange and terrifying existences. Thus, their corpses and certain objects that were around after them after their deaths would carry strange curses that harmed others. This was probably where the misfortune cloth puppet behind Tingen City's Cheney skate came from. Therefore, the 7 Orthodox churches forbade their believers from committing suicide through their own doctrine, and the royal family also promoted the corresponding legislation. Of course, this seemed ridiculous to Klein. How could a suicider be afraid of punishment by the law? While Mike was taking notes, he was about to say something when the owner of the coffee shop brought the food over. "Fill your stomach first, we'll talk later." Mike pointed to the toast. "All right." The old lady ate the food in small bites, appearing very cultured. Having not ordered much, she quickly finished her meal. After reluctantly drinking the last mouthful of coffee, she rubbed her temples and pleaded, "Can I get some sleep first? It's too cold outside." "No problem," Mike answered without hesitation. The old lady thanked him gratefully a few times before she sat down on the chair and curled up into a ball as she fell asleep. Mike looked at the man beside him and said, "You seem to be very familiar with this place. I wish to hire you as our guide. How's 3 solely for the day?" "I'm sorry, I forgot to ask for your name." The man quickly shook his head and said, No, that is too much. I only earn 1 solely a day most of the time at the dock. Just call me Old Kohler." "Then, 2 solely a day." "You deserve it," Mike decided firmly. After witnessing this strange bargaining, Klein blew into a piece of tissue and was about to drink another cup of coffee, when he suddenly sensed that something was wrong. He turned to look at the old lady who was curled up, asleep on the chair. Her face, which had turned ruddy due to the coffee, was pale again. The colors of her aura and moods had vanished. Klein stood up and subconsciously extended his hand to check the old lady's breathing. As Mike and Kohler looked at him in surprise, he said heavily, "She's dead." Mike opened his mouth, but no words came out. Kohler tapped his chest thrice and said with a bitter smile, "I knew she wouldn't be able to hold on for long. Such things happen every day in East Borough. At least she filled her stomach and died in a warm place. I hope it will be the same for me in the future." Klein was silent for a moment before he said, "Kohler, go and get the police." "All right." Kohler tapped his chest thrice once more and ran out of the coffee shop. The boss glanced over but didn't come over. It was as though it wasn't something he needed to concern himself with. After a while, a policeman in a black and white checkered uniform, carrying a baton and revolver, entered the coffee shop. He looked at the dead old lady, asked Mike and Klein a few questions, then he waved his hand and said, "That's all there is to this. The 3 of you can leave after I get someone to collect the corpse." "That's it?" Mike blurted out in surprise. He was obviously not very familiar with East Borough. The policeman sneered. "Such incidents happen in large numbers every day in East Borough." He rolled his eyes and looked at Klein and Mike. "You don't look like people from around here. Who are you? What's your identity?" Mike produced his press identification, and Klein said that he was a private detective responsible for protecting him. The policeman's face turned serious as he looked at Klein and said, I suspect that you're carrying a gun illegally. I want to search your belongings. Please cooperate with me, otherwise, it will be considered a case of resisting arrest. Mike was suddenly worried because he knew that private detectives were usually unlawfully possessing firearms. Klein expressionlessly spread out his hands. All right. He let the policeman search him, but nothing was found on him. After the old lady's corpse was taken away, the disappointed policeman left. Mike clenched his fist and pounded on the table. A living person just died here, yet, all he cares about is investigating the unlawful possession of firearms. Upon saying this, Mike looked at Klein and asked, puzzled, you didn't bring a gun? Klein shook his head, pulled out his holster and revolver from under the table, and said calmly, as a detective, I have a lot of experience in this area. As a magician, he could place the revolver right in front of someone and make it impossible for the person to notice it. Moreover, since he didn't buy any ordinary bullets, the Beyonder bullets were temporarily left above the gray fog. His revolver was currently empty, but this didn't stop him from shooting with his revolver. All he needed to do was to use his mouth to emulate a bang when he pulled the trigger. Upon seeing this, Old Kohler whispered from the side, so you're a detective. Klein pointed at Mike and casually explained, I was also entrusted with a mission by this gentleman the last time as well. Mike sat there without refuting. After a moment of silence, he said, although I've investigated the gangs and witnessed the miserable life of some prostitutes, I'm not familiar with the situation in East Borough. Please help me open my eyes to this place, allowing me to see if there are any problems with this investigation plan. As he spoke, he took a few sheets of paper from the inside pocket of his clothes and spread them out on the coffee shop table. Klein glanced at him. Interviews with East Borough residents of different ages? That's too troublesome, I think we can divide it according to location. In better apartments, 5 or 6 people squeeze into a one-room apartment. Others stay in the corner of a street that's sheltered from the wind, park benches, bars, and workhouses. In addition, they can be segregated by what time they begin work, and when their rest times are. Mike listened carefully and nodded. Not a bad idea. What do you think, Kohler? Old Kohler pinched his nose and said, I can't read, but I think whatever Mr. Detective said seems all right. Mike thought about it, changed his plan, and said, then let's go to a nearby apartment and make a random selection. 354 Tales of an sAdventures in East Borough plus, turn off reset. Backlands East Borough, at an intersection. Mike Joseph saw a number of pitiful-looking children in rags along the street. He wiped his mouth with a handkerchief and planned to head over to give them some pennies. However, his action was stopped by the former tramp, Old Kohler. They're thieves. Thieves? What about their parents? Or are they controlled by the gangs? As a senior journalist, Mike had never been to the East Borough, but he had heard of instances of a few gangs controlling street children to steal and beg. Parents? They either don't have parents, or their parents were once thieves or might still be thieves. Of course, Mr. Reporter, you're right, many of them are under the control of gangs, and it's said that the gangs will teach them how to steal. For example, they will hang a gentleman's coat on a wall, put a handkerchief in the pocket, and hang a pocket watch on the outside, and through repeated practice, the children will attempt to steal the handkerchief without shaking the pocket watch. This is what I heard from others while at the workhouse when I was homeless. Old Kohler babbled on, I remember the youngest thief ever caught on this street was only 6 years old. Sigh, 6 years old. He seemed to recall his child who was lost to a disease and couldn't help but take out a cigarette from his pocket. He couldn't bring himself to smoke it, so all he did was take a sniff. 6 years old. Mike was stunned by this number. Klein quietly listened and sighed. This is East Borough. He looked around, composed himself, and said, this place is closer to the jungle than to human society. Our interview has to be treated as an adventure. You have to learn how to avoid the territory of dangerous creatures, but you must also avoid those little things that don't seem to be too harmful to you. Well, I'm talking about mosquitoes in the jungle. Mike, if you expose the thickness of your wallet to those kids, then even if you protect it well and don't let them steal it, robbery is a destined outcome during the rest of the adventure. If you dare to resist, then perhaps there will be one more body floating in the Tussock River tomorrow morning. Mr. Detective, you're absolutely right. There are so many people in East Borough. No one pays notice to the few missing people every day, Old Kohler agreed. Mike listened intently for a few seconds, and after a few seconds of silence, he suddenly said, 1.35 million. Huh? Because of his cold, Klein's throat was obviously a little hoarse. Mike stepped forward and said, "This is a preliminary estimate of the population count of East Borough. But I know that there's definitely more than that." That many? Old Kohler was startled. Although he had experienced the days and nights in East Borough and knew that there were a lot of residents here, he didn't expect there to be this many. This is several times the population of Tingen City. Klein subconsciously compared it with the place that was most familiar to him. He looked at the intersection a few steps away and asked, "Which way should we go next?" Old Kohler looked up and said, "Definitely not straight. That area is under the control of the Zmanger gang. They're very vicious and completely unreasonable. If they discover any reporters doing interviews, then they'll definitely beat us up." The Zmanger gang? Isn't that the brainless gang that caused me to lose 10,000 pounds? He was some kind of executioner. I don't even remember his name. Fortunately, the 10,000 pounds was eventually exchanged for the Seer's corresponding sequence 7, 6, and 5 potion formulas and the all-black eye, as well as the Intis ambassador's life. I wonder who ended up obtaining the manuscript of the third-generation difference engine. Klein instantly recalled what had happened early last month. Zmanger gang? The gang that is mainly composed of Highlanders? Mike asked thoughtfully. "Mr. Reporter, have you heard of them?" Old Kohler asked in surprise. Mike sneered. "They're involved in a lot of cases, and they have some reputation outside East Borough as well. It's said that one of the members was involved in a case of Intis espionage. The person next to you was the person in question, the person who made the report, and also the victim." Klein silently added, "If you gentlemen know about the Zmanger gang, then why doesn't the police arrest them?" Old Kohler asked from his viewpoint, of someone at the bottom of society. Mike's expression suddenly turned a little awkward, and he coughed twice. "We can only capture those who have committed crimes. There is no evidence for the rest, so we can't arrest them. Moreover, East Borough is so broad, and there are so many people. It would be hard to find anyone who is bent on hiding." As he spoke, he sighed. It's easy to destroy one's Zmanger gang, but as long as a Highlander comes to Backland, and if they keep up their strong tradition of being combative while failing to find any other means of earning a living, it's only a matter of time before a new Zmanger gang appears. This is a complex social issue. Klein pointed to the left and right. "Pick one." Old Kohler looked at the right side of the street. "That's where the Proscrito gang is active. As long as we don't provoke the girls who do business on the streets or in the bars, they won't notice us. Haha, it's still morning, so there shouldn't be any problems. They're still sleeping." The word proscrito meant outlaw in the Lone language, so it could be said that the gang who gave itself such a name was pretty self-aware. Klein and Mike had no objection to this, and with the guide leading the way, they entered the district. The buildings here were relatively better. The streets were less squalid, and the air was filled with the smells of oyster soup, fried fish, ginger beer, and the smell of various food and beverages left behind by street vendors, as well as the fishy smell of fish-related products. While walking here, Klein felt an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was as if he had returned to Tingen City, to Iron Cross Street, and to the street outside the apartment where he had originally lived in. The only difference was that Backland was closer to the sea and had more traffic. There was a lot more fish. This is a relatively good apartment in this area. Back when I loitered around here, I discovered that the gentlemen and ladies inside are all, quite clean. Old Kohler pointed to a pale yellow 3-story building. As they got closer, they noticed a sign hanging in front of the apartment. It had a picture of a pocket watch, a clock, and a screwdriver, with the words watch repair. A watch craftsman lives here. Klein dug up a similar scene from the memory fragments of the original Klein. Back then, Benson, Melissa, and himself had gone to somewhere similar to repair the silver pocket watch which his father had left behind, but despite repairing it several times, it would quickly break. This continued until Melissa fiddled with it and ultimately fully repaired it. It became the most decent thing on Klein's person during that period of time. After Klein's death, the pocket watch, which had both monetary and sentimental value, was not buried with him. It should now belong to Benson, right? I wonder if he will think of me every time he takes out that pocket watch. Klein suddenly blinked and curled the corner of his lips. Probably. Mike wasn't sure. If anything went wrong with his pocket watch, it was usually sent to the original watch store he bought it from. The store would then send it to a repairman or to a craftsman who had partnered with them. As soon as they entered the apartment, they saw a middle-aged man with a messy beard. The gentleman had just come out of the bathroom and was about to return to his room. When he saw the three strangers come in, he hurriedly asked, "Do you want to repair something?" What a coincidence. We actually met the craftsman immediately. Klein was slightly puzzled. Mike took out his pocket watch, smiled, and said, "Yes, my pocket watch has recently not been keeping time well. Can you help me take a look?" He didn't reveal his identity and planned to interview him over some casual chit-chat. The middle-aged man immediately revealed a smile and led them into a two-bedroom apartment which had its door half concealed. He pointed at a chair beside the table and said, "Please wait a moment. I'll go get my tools." "Your tools are not at home?" Mike asked in surprise. The watch craftsman shook his head and laughed. "How is that possible? A set of tools is very expensive. There's no way I can buy them on my own. The only way is to pool everyone's money together to buy 3 or 4 sets, and whoever has business will use them. So, we moved in together. Heh, it's more convenient this way. If we live too far away, we will have to spend extra time and pay for the public carriage to borrow the tools." As he spoke, he left the room and walked to the side. So it isn't a coincidence that we met a watch craftsman. Many of the residents here are of this profession. Klein was suddenly enlightened. Old Kohler looked around the room and enviously said, "Before I fell ill, I lived in such a place as well. My wife would help others sew clothes at home. And my two children. Mike sighed and lowered his voice. "I thought watch craftsmen were rich." "Me too." Klein covered his mouth. After a cordial exchange with several of the apartment's residents, Klein and the others once again embarked on their adventure. They had walked about 100 meters when they heard people quarreling along the street. The two women were using all sorts of obscenities against each other, allowing Klein to learn many words he had never heard before. The reason for their argument was that the one on the left accused the woman on the right for making the apartment they lived in dirty and noisy. The woman on the right was scolding the woman on the left, thinking that it had nothing to do with her. After all, no one asked her to recruit guests at night and sleep during the day. "Is that a laundry maid?" Mike asked, frowning slightly. "Yes, I know her. She's a widow, helping people wash their clothes with her 2 daughters, Old Kohler answered certainly. Mike thought for a few seconds and said, "Take me to their place." Old Kohler nodded and led the two of them around the argument before they entered the dilapidated apartment building that was obviously inferior to the one they had just seen. As soon as he arrived outside the laundry maid's room, Klein immediately felt the dampness. In the room hung dresses that were not dried yet. A 17 or 18-year-old girl was squatting in front of a large basin, scrubbing clothes that were covered in bubbles. A girl, that was younger than her, was holding a hot iron wrapped in wet linen cloth. She was carefully ironing the clothes that were done washing and drying. Her careful actions implied that she had been scalded by the steam several times. This was both their workplace and the place where they slept at night. Wet moisture permeated the room and seeped into their bodies. In addition, the stench of all kinds of smells was very distinct. "Doesn't it feel terrible?" Mike pinched his nose. Klein replied in a muffled voice, "I've got a cold." There was no humor in his words. Mike released his fingers, walked into the room, and said to the two surprised girls, "I'm a reporter. I would like to interview a laundry maid." The girl who was scrubbing the clothes shook her head numbly and said, "We have a lot of things to do and cannot afford to waste time." Mike's request for an interview was rejected. He came out with a heavy expression and silently walked back across the street. After taking a look, he pursed his lips and said, "Let's continue." City of Silver. After a thorough examination of Derek Berg, who had experienced hallucinations both visually and auditory, he was brought to the bottom of the spire. This place took in residents who showed signs of losing control, and various methods were used to save them. Walking in the gloomy and creepy corridor, he suddenly felt a strange chill. "Help!" A sharp, shrill voice suddenly sounded from a sealed room. "Help!" The voice came to a sudden halt, and then there was silence. In the eerie silence, the first thought Derek Berg had when he came back to his senses was to rescue that person. However, the two guards that held him in the middle didn't show any reaction to it, as if everything that had just happened was just his imagination. "Someone is calling out for help," the young Derek informed the two Dawn Paladins. On his left, a tall knight clad in silver armor calmly replied, "Don't be fooled. That's just the normal behavior of those Beyonders who are on the verge of losing control." "Is that so? Maybe he cried out for help because he just isn't willing to give up and lose control and become a monster," Derek thought sorrowfully. Following the change in his mood, the illusory, buzzing sound in his ears became more distinct. After silently taking a few steps forward, the Dawn Paladin from before pointed to a door on the left and said, "You will be staying here for the time being. We will bring you your food and medicine on time." As he spoke, he took out an iron-black bottle. This bottle was constructed from the remnants of the straw-like objects left over from the City of Silver's staple food, black-faced grass. Upon encountering a liquid, it would produce a thin film, thereby achieving a waterproof and sealing effect. Derek took the bottle and gulped it down, feeling a cool sensation slide down his esophagus and into his stomach. His entire being rapidly became quiet. The swaying scenes before his eyes stabilized, and the auditory hallucinations in his ears gradually weakened. Creak. At the sound of the iron door closing and locking, Derek entered his own room. The first thing he saw was a candle flickering with a faint yellow light, and then he made out a low bed, a chair, and a square table. Other than that, there was nothing else. However, the walls, including the door, were all engraved with complicated and mysterious symbols and labels. They seemed to form a complete seal. Derek's emotions were also suppressed by the medicine. He sat down on the bed without the slightest hint of curiosity before lying down. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly heard the sound of someone banging on his door. However, this didn't come from outside his room, but from his neighboring cell. Derek sat up and listened. He heard a sharp, high-pitched wail from the knocking. His hair stood on end as he abruptly stood up, taking an extremely defensive stance. At this moment, thumping sounds spread to the metal walls that were separated by two rooms, slowly smashing a protrusion. Derek was about to pray for holy light when the scene before his eyes suddenly lit up. It seemed as if the entire space around him had been moved to the outside world, just in time for the lightning to streak past. The sound of the wall being smashed beside him had vanished, and the bottom of the spire regained its silence. It wasn't an absolute silence. Rather, the sound of light footsteps echoed for a long distance. It only turned silent after the echoes continued on for a long time. Derek was wondering what had happened to the Beyonder in the neighboring cell when someone knocked on the metal wall on the other side. Tack. 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 It was as if someone had bent their finger and was tapping lightly. "Who is it?" Derek asked, raising his voice in slight alarm. The knocking immediately stopped, and after a few seconds, a deep yet rather old voice was faintly transmitted. "So it turns out to be a young fellow. You are?" Seeing that the other person could communicate rationally, Derek leaned against the wall and pressed his ear against the cold metal. The elderly voice chuckled and said, "The person next to you almost lost control several times. He ultimately couldn't be saved today." "He completely lost control?" Derek asked through the metal wall. "So he's become a monster now?" "No, not a monster, but a corpse. He was finished off by the items sealed in here." The elderly voice sighed. "I've been here for 42 years. Yes, those guards told me that they've seen too many similar incidents." Derek was surprised and returned with a question. "You've been here for 42 years? Normally speaking, losing control could be divided into 3 stages. The first stage was warning signs, such as auditory and visual hallucinations. In the second stage, the person's body and mind were already out of control, and from time to time, they would display either terrifying or strange states. As for the third stage, it was a complete breakdown, transforming the rampager into a terrifying monster. The time it took from the second stage to the third stage was rather quick. Perhaps just after discovering the symptoms, one would witness a seemingly ordinary beyonder turn into a monster which could be found deep in the darkness. In other words, after a second stage beyonder was sent to the bottom of the spire, they would either be treated with medicine, rituals, and other methods, slowly stabilizing themselves and allowing them to leave within 18 months. Otherwise, they would quickly lose control and be purged. It was impossible for anyone to be locked up for 42 years. As a first-stage beyonder, they would only take between a few days to less than 20 days to eliminate all the symptoms and leave, fully treated. The elderly voice immediately chuckled and said, "That's right, I also didn't expect that I would stay here for 42 years. I don't have any signs of losing control, but they believe I'm rather dangerous and can turn into a monster at any time." Derek frowned slightly and asked curiously, "What happened 42 years ago?" At that time, neither of his parents had been born yet. The elderly voice was silent for a moment before saying, "I was once the captain of an exploration team. We found a destroyed city about half a month away from the City of Silver. This was calculated based on our speed. That city was similar to our City of Silver. It clearly has traces of it being ruled by giants, and it also believed in the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God. Unfortunately, they were destroyed countless years ago." Derek wasn't a stranger to such matters. He immediately guessed, because you encountered some strange incidents there, you were determined to be at risk of losing control? More or less. The elderly voice chuckled. After we explored the core area, we discovered that the city was attempting to change faiths. They created deities that they imagined would save them. However, it was useless. Even the statues of those deities were destroyed and spilled all across the land. At this point, his tone suddenly became heavy. "However, we met a person there. This is the first time in the past 2,000 years that our City of Silver had met someone who didn't belong to our city. Outside City of Silver, in the depths of the endless darkness, there really was someone still alive." Derek subconsciously asked, "You brought him back to the City of Silver?" The elderly voice said after 2 seconds, "Don't you feel shocked? The reason why our City of Silver works so hard to explore the surroundings is to find humans like us. We finally found them 42 years ago. This is indeed rather shocking news, but I often see Miss Justice, Mr. Hanged Man, and the others. I often hear of the Lone Kingdom and the 7 Orthodox gods. Isn't it very obvious that there are people outside the City of Silver, with cities and countries?" Derek scratched his head, and without much experience, he pretended to be shocked. I didn't notice this point. This is truly unbelievable. Other than the residents of the City of Silver, there are actually other people." The elderly voice remained silent for a while before saying, "Has the City of Silver's education become so terrible?" Without waiting for Derek to speak, he sighed and said to himself, "We very warily invited that person to the City of Silver as a guest." After some consideration, he agreed. We monitored and escorted him along the way back, but when we had almost arrived at the City of Silver, he suddenly disappeared. We searched everywhere, but we couldn't find him. After we returned to the City of Silver, my team members went crazy, one by one. They lost control. All of them. Not a single one was spared. The 6-member council suspected that we were contaminated by something and that the person was not a human at all, but an evil spirit, a monster. So, they locked me up here, and every so often, they would come over to confirm my condition, but they would never tell me what the problem is, nor would they let me out. Derek exhaled heavily and asked, "Do you remember what that man looked like?" He looked very ordinary, and nothing about him stood out. He was dressed just like us, and except for me remembering that he was a man, I can't remember what he looked like. However, the elders should be able to use Beyonder means to directly see him from my vague, forgotten memories. The elderly voice recalled for nearly a minute and said with a bit of pain. Derek pressed him, casually, "Did he say what his name was? Did he tell you about his origins?" The elderly voice acknowledged tersely. "He told us that his name was..." He paused for a moment before saying, "Amon. Sunday morning, in the factory district." In the past 2 days, Klein and Mike visited many places in East Borough under Old Kohler's guidance. As a result, Mike witnessed 5 or 6 people huddled together in a single room, and that wasn't the worst case he saw. In the poorest areas of East Borough, an ordinary bedroom could accommodate 10 people. The precise division of the right to use the floor and the time of use, day or night, shocked the reporter. Moreover, poverty didn't discriminate between men and women. In those places, people of different genders squeezed in tight spaces without being able to abide by societal norms. Certain incidents which deserved time in court happened all the time. Whether it was men or women, all of them were always facing the threat of violence. Squalid, crowded, smelly, that's the most objective impression. I suspect that every one of them has a serious problem of having parasites. Because the houses were built a long time ago in the most rundown districts, they aren't connected to the sewers. Feces, urine, vomit and other things can be found everywhere. Every house here only has one public bathroom, or worse, every street only has one public toilet. They're extremely busy every day, but they can only barely fill their stomachs without any savings. As long as they're unemployed for a few days, they'll fall into an irredeemable abyss. I don't think they would even be afraid of death if they were given even a little hope. Mike wrote in his investigation manuscript. In addition, the reporter was impressed by the tramps who wandered the streets in the middle of the night, the girls who stood numbly by the street or in the bars, as well as the drinkers who completely let loose with their drinking. They didn't hold back on using violence and didn't consider the future. All of this left a deep impression on this reporter. He grew more and more silent. Cough. Mike Joseph took out his handkerchief, covered his mouth, and coughed several times. The smog in the factory district was thicker than anywhere else. The air was gray with a yellowish tint as though it was floating dust. Occasionally a pungent, suffocating odor that even Mr. Reporter, who was long used to the backland air, could not bear. He turned to Klein, who was also coughing softly. I've always been a huge supporter of the government's establishment of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and the Alkaline Industry Inspector, but only today did I learn that the problem has become so serious. If we don't take effective measures, it may become a tragedy in the future. Klein tried hard to clear his blocked nose. Perhaps the whole of Backland would be shrouded in smog that results in one's vision not exceeding 5 meters, and it's possible that an evil god would descend or be born in such a backdrop, he added silently. Old Kohler didn't quite understand the conversation. He cleared his throat that was filled with thick phlegm and led the reporter and the detective around the watchman and into a lead factory. Most of the workers were women. They were working busily without any protection, and the factory floor was filled with dust. Looking at the tiny particles floating in the air, Klein felt like he was looking at toxic gas. The young ladies without masks were like lambs waiting to be slaughtered. For a moment, he felt as though he was back in Tingen, back to the time when he had helped Sir Deweyville deal with the grievance haunting him. He seemed to have already witnessed the future of each and every female worker, some of them with throbbing heads, some with blurred vision, some turning hysterical, some with gums with a blue line, and finally, they either went blind or fell dead. It's like a large-scale, bloody sacrificial ritual. The only difference is that the target is that flashing symbol of money. If the Aurora Order, Rose School of Thought, and other evil sects could make good use of similar situations, just like what Lenevis did, there would be a huge problem. Klein covered his mouth and nose as he quietly watched. Mike Joseph muttered in surprise and anger, "How can this be? How can they be like this?" A while ago, all sorts of newspapers and magazines were focused on the issue of lead poisoning. Why aren't they using any precautionary measures at all? They can't even bear to use a mask? These factory owners are murderers. He truly is a reporter with a sense of righteousness. Even though he isn't young, he's rather stingy, and his acting is pretty outstanding, he still retains his original pure motives. But how is he so aware of lead poisoning? Right, I forgot. I had gotten Sir Deweyville to advertise the dangers of lead poisoning on the newspapers and magazines. It seems like he did it well, but for some people, what does it matter if one or two of the lower-class commoners die? There are plenty of people waiting for jobs. Klein thought with a heavy heart. As a senior journalist, Mike didn't lose his reason. He quietly observed and asked a few workers who had changed shifts, then he left the lead factory. Subsequently, they entered one factory after another, but lost their mood to discuss anything when they saw the squalor of the place and the intensive labor involved. It was almost noon when Klein suddenly discovered that there were a lot of people gathered outside a factory. They were mostly women, and they were excitedly shouting something and were trying to rush in. What happened? Mike asked Old Kohler, puzzled. Old Kohler was also puzzled. I'll go over and ask. He jogged to the outside of the factory and blended into the crowd. It took him several minutes to get back to Klein and Mike. They're going to smash those new machines. Old Kohler took a breath and got to the point. Why? Mike hadn't been in charge of similar news before, and so he didn't know much about the situation. As for Klein, he had an inkling of the reason. Old Kohler pointed to the factory and said, "This is a textile factory. They wish to use the latest textile machines, so the number of people in charge of controlling the machines needed will decrease. It seems like they're going to fire a third of the workers. The female workers want to smash the machines and get their jobs back, or else they'll probably not survive. Perhaps, the only choice is for them to become street girls." Mike opened his mouth. From the shape of his mouth, he looked like he was going to say fools, but he didn't say anything in the end. He just looked in silence and didn't even move closer. Let's go back. I pretty much finished my investigative interviews. After a long time, Mike sighed. All three of them turned around and began to walk out of the factory district. No one spoke as they walked. As they were about to part, Mike glanced at Klein and spoke in a low voice. Do you think those women can still find anything else to do if the lead factories who do not provide protection are shut down, or if their bosses are sent to court? Klein gave it some serious thought and said, if it's just a few factories, there won't be much of a problem, but some female workers might suffer from the hunger and cold while looking for other jobs, and they would gradually lose their strength because they don't have any savings. It would be a disaster if too many factories are shut down in a short period of time, not to mention the people who lose their jobs after the new textile machines are used. The Backland factory district alone might have thousands or even tens of thousands of unemployed workers, who have no food or clothing, roaming the streets like zombies. They might lower the conditions of their pay in order to snatch the jobs of others. Who knows how many people in East Borough will lead an even more difficult life or die as a result. It would be a hell-like scene, and even if this world doesn't have beyonder powers, it would still bring about a huge disaster. And now, the various evil gods are lurking in the darkness, waiting. Klein swallowed all the words in his mind. Mike fell silent again, and after paying £10 and 6 soldi, he left the smoke-emitting factory district in a carriage. Klein looked at the carriage ride into the distance but didn't say anything. Back when he was a Nighthawk, he had known and come into contact with the lives of the poor, but the impression left on him wasn't as deep this time. A multidimensional observation revealed a human abyss in front of his eyes. East Borough is truly filled with hidden dangers and tinder-like threats. If one isn't careful, it can be ignited by a cult. Klein pondered for a few seconds and said, Kohler, I'd like to ask you to help me keep an eye on the situation in East Borough. Oh, only when you're not bogged down by work. I'll pay you, giving you the money to build a relationship with the other workers. Every week, we will set a time to meet at the coffee shop from before. Old Kohler's eyes lit up. No problem. He made no mention of the price, and he fully trusted the good detective. Klein weighed his options and said, every time we meet, I'll give you 15 solely as funds and compensation. If you provide me with information that I'm satisfied with, there will also be an additional 5 solely as payment. A pound? Old Kohler blurted out in shock. In his warmest and happiest days, he was paid only 21 solely a week, or £1 1 solely. Yes. Klein nodded. You have to pay attention to your words and actions. Don't be in a hurry to gather information. Maintain a state of speaking less and listening more. Otherwise, you'll be in danger. Informant fees such as these can theoretically be reimbursed, but I'm now a self-sponsored 50p party. Klein sighed as he gave a self-deprecating laugh. Empress Borough, in Miss Audrey's study within Count Hall's luxurious villa. The blonde was listening to Miss Escalante, her psychology teacher, as she occasionally stroked Susie, the big dog who was sitting beside her. With dark hair that went all the way down to her waist, Escalante Ocelica noticed that the dog also seemed to be listening intently. She couldn't help but smile and pause for 2 seconds. Following that, she continued with her introduction. There are currently no completely orthodox theories in the field of psychology. There are several schools of thought, such as psychoanalysis, personality analysis, and behavioral psychology. Of course, research on the mind is not only performed by psychologists and psychiatrists. Many professionals in the field of mysticism are also doing similar work. Among them, the most famous one is, sorry, I deviated from the curriculum. Let's return to the topic just now and talk about psychoanalysis. Audrey could clearly notice Escalante's intention to guide the topic, therefore, she feigned ignorance and asked curiously, Teacher, I'd like to know more about the research situation for the mind in the field of mysticism. As you know, I'm very interested in that. Escalante pursed her lips, frowned, and said in embarrassment, but there are vows of secrecy. I mean, these theories and research are part of the secrets of the mysticism circles. They're privy to those on the inside. Is that so? Then can I join? Audrey asked expectantly. They aren't involved in anything evil, right? How is that possible? It's just a seminar organized by enthusiasts. Escalante diverted the topic after mentioning it. Let's talk about this later. Let's continue with the lesson first. I've got to know where to draw the line. I'll do it one step at a time. If this is the general trait of the members of the psychology alchemists, then I don't have to worry too much about it being filled with lunatics and perverts like Mr. A. Audrey deliberately put on an expression of reluctance when skipping the subject, but she still politely listened to the theoretical foundations of psychoanalysis. When the class was over, and after sending Escalante off, she returned to the study, carefully closed the heavy wooden door, and said to the huge golden retriever, Susie, what do you think of her? She's not sincere. Susie answered flatly. Then, she tilted her head and said, however, what she said is very interesting. I think it's even more interesting than meat and biscuits. Susie, do you wish to be a psychiatrist in the future? Specializing in the treatment of mental illness in animals? For example, that horse which is suspected to suffer from depression at the Glaints. Audrey suddenly fell into deep thought, wondering if she should prepare a special white coat and gold-rimmed glasses for Susie to look a little more professional, play on words of 50-cent party. When he got back to Minsk Street from the factory district, Klein had a simple lunch and took a nap. He didn't wake up until the evening when the sky had darkened. But even so, he still felt exhausted, exhaustion that stemmed from the depths of his heart. After quite some time of being lost in thought, Klein went down to the first floor and lit the gas lamp. He prepared to sit on the sofa and read the day's newspapers, but when he glanced around, he saw an invitation letter on the coffee table. He was stunned for a moment before realizing that it was an invitation letter which Mrs. Stellan Sammer had sent her maidservant to deliver a few days ago. I almost forgot about this. The disguised matchmaking banquet. Klein put down the invitation letter and walked to the bathroom on the first floor. He used cold water to wash his face, sprucing himself up to look much more energetic. Compared to when he first arrived at Backlund, there was a much thicker black stubble around his lips and under his chin. Although it didn't completely eliminate his scholarly bearing, it made him look more mature and rugged. Someone who doesn't really know me well wouldn't be able to recognize me in person. Klein exhaled silently, wiped his face clean, and put his gold-rimmed glasses on the bridge of his nose. He took a short break, changed into a shirt with a starched collar and a black tailcoat, and then, quite formally, he put on his silk half-top hat and picked up his cane stick and invitation letter before leaving the house for the unit beside his. Amidst the tinkling of the doorbell, he saw Julianne, the maidservant, open the door, and Stellan with her blonde hair coiled up high, and her ears adorned with silver earrings. Klein took off his hat, bowed, and praised politely, "Mrs. Sammer, you are very beautiful today." Although his words were extremely perfunctory, it was true that she was much more beautiful than usual. It appeared that her ability to doll herself up meticulously had experienced a significant breakthrough. It seems like the adultery case made her besties with Ma'am Mary. Besides, Mary is now a tycoon with a wealth of tens of thousands of pounds, and she has been admitted into the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, allowing her to acquaint herself with many people in power. She must have had sufficient experience in the areas of makeup, clothing, accessories, and so on. Klein nodded in understanding. The corners of Stellan's mouth couldn't help but curl up. "These are my new earrings that cost 8 soldi. Lady, you haven't changed in the slightest." Klein smiled and handed his hat, cane, and coat to the maidservant. The fireplace and the pipes in the room brought the warmth of early summer. Many women and young ladies were not dressed that conservatively. Some of their fair arms were exposed, while others bared their creamy chests. "Luke is talking business with some friends. Let me apologize on his behalf." Stellan played her role as the female host to its fullest. "Have your meal first. I'll introduce you to a few well-educated ladies later." "Actually, there's no need for that. Just let me eat in peace." Klein smiled. "I can already smell the fragrance of the food." Since there were quite a lot of guests, with over 20 of them, the dinner was in the form of a buffet. Klein took a plate and walked around, and he found that the food was a lot more varied than before. Cold trout, chicken pie, mutton stew with peas, salted breast, curry, roast beef, turkey, beef tongue pastry, ham, salad, and cream cake. The alcohol provided was still champagne and red wine. This suited a carnivore's palate very well. Klein, with his large plate, didn't make conversation with anyone. He hid in a corner and slowly savored the food. It's not as good as the chefs at the Quelag Club. From time to time, he would inwardly make comments on the food. He was about to go for second helpings when he was finally discovered by Stellan Sammer. At the same time, he saw an acquaintance beside the lady. He was none other than lawyer Jürgen with his serious expression. "Right, Jürgen is also a bachelor." Klein smiled and walked over, taking the initiative to ask, "How is Mrs. Doris's recovery?" Jürgen uncomfortably tugged at his bow tie. "She'll be discharged next week." "That's great," Klein sincerely said with mixed emotions. At that moment, Stellan had already brought a few young ladies over and introduced them. "This is Mr. Jürgen Cooper, a senior solicitor, who earns at least £3 a week. He often gets a commission from the cases he handles, and he definitely earns more than £200 a year. Furthermore, he is young and capable. He will most likely become a great lawyer in the future. This is Mr. Sherlock Moriarty, a well-known detective. His income is unstable, but he is paid handsomely for every mission he receives, for example 10 or 50 pounds. Lady, isn't this too direct?" Klein couldn't help but silently lampoon. Jürgen, who was standing beside him, evidently frowned. Without feeling that she had made a faux pas, Stellan continued the introductions. Miss Sarah Taylor. Her parents are teachers at a grammar school. Miss Angelina Watson. Her father is a civil servant at the Backland Police Department. Klein smiled numbly and greeted each lady. After Stellan was done, Jurgen said in a deep voice, Mrs. Sammer, it's impolite to mention the income of others in front of others. Stellan wasn't mad. Instead, she replied very seriously, no, it's very important. If you end up liking each other and decide to start a family, then income is essential. Think about it, there must be meat, vegetables, fruits, milk, white bread, butter, cream, and other foods every day. It costs at least £1.05 solely a week on food alone, not to mention the alcohol. In addition, to rent a better house is nearly £1 a week. Yes, there's also the need to purchase water, gas, charcoal, soap, and the like. One still needs to consider transportation expenses. This adds up to about 10 solely. That is just the most fundamental expenses. Are you not bringing your wife to a musical concert or to go watch a play? Don't you need to get new clothes every year? Ladies, I believe that a family must spend at least £30 a year on it in order to be considered to be living a decent life. In addition, there is the salary of the maid, the cost of education for any children, the emergency money that's needed to be set aside for medical treatment, as well as the expenditure of some necessary decorations. Only with an income of more than £200 a year can those needs be met. Only then can a happy family be achieved. Thus, in order to not delay everyone's time or cause any misunderstandings, I believe it is necessary to include this in the introduction. As a lawyer, Jurgen was momentarily unable to provide a rejoinder. Fortunately, he always had a serious and stern expression on his face. How big-hearted. But the basic etiquette is to tell the two parties this information in private, and of course, I know exactly why you're making the introduction straight to their face. Klein smiled. Yes, income is very important. Only with an income of more than £400 a year can one host a dinner at this level. Only with that much can one afford to have his wife be dressed in beautiful dresses and exquisite earrings. Stellan raised her chin slightly as she tried her best to suppress her smile and said, £430. I mean that there must be some savings each year, to prevent any accidents or to have spare cash to invest into stocks or bonds. That was her husband's approximate annual income. After finding a common topic for the two groups of strangers, she left and greeted the other guests. Klein could also clearly sense that Sarah, Angelina, and the other ladies were more interested in lawyer Jurgen. After all, he was a good-looking man, and his job and income were very stable. As for a private detective who might be locked up in the police station at any time, they were not the first choice for middle-class women. Besides, Klein now looked rugged with his beard. It wasn't a surprise that the girls would remain a little apprehensive towards him. After a short casual chat with them, he found an excuse to leave before hiding in a corner and eating while he enjoyed watching Jurgen's awkward and helpless performance. At this moment, it was a wonder where his eloquence as a lawyer had gone to. A few minutes later, the two children of the Sammers ran past Klein while playing. They noticed the gentleman in the corner, stopped, and, with widened eyes, asked curiously, Mr. Moriarty, we heard that you're a detective. Yes. Klein smiled in response. The little girl said innocently, can you tell us about the cases you've cracked? Her twin brother nodded immediately. The cases I cracked? If it doesn't involve wraiths, puppets, or devil dogs, then it's about finding cats or catching an adulterer. There's really nothing suitable for children. Klein thought for a few seconds, then chuckled. All right, this is a story about treasure. An officer who had just returned from East Borough was suddenly murdered. He had mostly forgotten the detective novels he had read in his previous life, so he could only make them up based on a vague impression. The two children didn't care about the irrationality of the plot and listened very seriously, even learning to ask what happened next. Without realizing it, Klein was a lot more relaxed. When the banquet was almost over, and he was about to leave, he saw that Stellan's face was filled with joy. What is the cause for celebration? Klein casually asked. Stellan raised her head slightly and replied with a reserved smile, Mary has received a luncheon invitation from the Chief Secretary of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council, Mr. Hibbert Hall, on Monday. This gentleman is the eldest son of Count Hall, a true nobleman. He has invited all the members of the council and has allowed them to bring 2 or 3 friends with them. Stellan paused. Luke and I were just invited by Mary. Monday afternoon. Dressed to the nines, Stellan Sammer, who was accompanied by her husband Luke Sammer, followed Ma'am Mary to Empress Borough where they saw a large building. Marble statues, pools, fountains, gardens, and lawns reflected themselves in her eyes, making her feel nervous even before she entered the villa. "Luke, does my necklace not match my dress?" she asked her husband as she tilted her head. Luke shook his head and laughed. "Darling, you're too nervous. You don't have to worry about that. The nobles only live in a place that's slightly bigger than ours and eat a little better. We aren't lacking in any way." Stellan nodded when she heard that, as though she had found her confidence. Entering the villa, they saw the gorgeous crystal chandelier, the hall which could accommodate many dancers, and the plates of delicious food. Foie gras, pan-fried dragonbone fish, baked lobster. Warmer grape wine, misty champagne. It's exactly the same as the magazine's description. Stellan looked at the food with curiosity, thinking that she could have such a meal on a holiday or during New Year's if they scrimped a little. Except for the warmer wine and the misty champagne, she finally added in her mind. At this moment, her gaze suddenly straightened as she saw a young girl wearing a beige palace dress walking over. The girl had blonde hair and green eyes, and she was abnormally beautiful. She wore a pair of white silk gloves with a pair of small beautiful emerald earrings. She exuded pureness and elegance. "She's just like an angel." Even though she had always been proud of her appearance, Stellan couldn't help but exclaim in admiration, and she felt an inexplicable sense of inferiority at that moment. "Hello," she clumsily greeted with the etiquette she had just learned. "Hello," the girl returned the greeting gracefully. After they had passed each other, Stellan accompanied her husband and Mary to meet the distinguished guests and the noble, Mr. Hibbert Hall. After a while, she walked to the balcony by herself, intending to ease her mood. However, she unexpectedly saw the angelic girl from before. She was looking out over the landscape. A large golden retriever obediently sat beside her rose ribbon-rimmed shoes. "It's so cute." Stellan made an attempt to make conversation. The young girl replied with a faint smile, "Let me thank you on Susie's behalf for your praise." As she looked at the duo, Stellan suddenly felt that she should own a similar pet for herself. This was the only way to showcase the Sammers' dignity. She asked in a measured tone, "I heard that the nobles rear a lot of hunting hounds. Is this one of them?" "Yes." The girl whose emerald green eyes looked more enchanting than her earrings' gems lightly nodded. "May I know how much money is needed to buy one?" Stellan asked with a smile. The pure and elegant girl looked down at the huge golden retriever and, without minding the question, answered with a slight smile, £450. On a luxurious carriage on their way leaving Count Hall's villa. Luke was chatting with Ma'am Mary about the distinguished guests, such as the chairman of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and chief of the National Weather Service, Sir Durs Shah, or the council member of the National Atmospheric Pollution Council and president of the Royal Meteorological Society, House of Commons Member of Parliament, Mr. Cave, or Mid-Seashire Medical Health's director in charge and renowned doctor, Mr. Hawksley. They were all influential figures in the government, and the royal family or parliament. And the council's final report would be the most important basis for the planned Anti-Pollution Act and Smoke Emission Act. The Quim Company, which specialized in anthracite and charcoal, was trying to promote and expedite the development, disrupting older but larger competitors from handling the changes. They will certainly not be stingy with their money and will certainly lobby the heavyweight members of parliament to interfere with our investigation. We must have a clear solution, just like what Mr. Hibbert Hall said. We need to take hold of public opinion and let the newspapers and magazines repeat the horrors of smoke pollution. Luke was a senior manager at Quim, a key assistant to Quim's major shareholder and person in control, Mary, and he himself was quite capable. As they chatted, Luke suddenly noticed that his wife was sitting next to him without saying a word, as if she had lost her soul. "Stellan, what happened?" Luke asked with concern. Stellan jolted back to her senses, forced a smile, and said, "Nothing, I'm just a little tired." "That's right. You must be extremely tense seeing so many important figures. Now, you can finally relax. Exhaustion is a very normal thing. Actually, it's the same for me." Luke smiled. Stellan didn't respond. Instead, she looked out the window towards the park with a lake. Her ears were still ringing with the casual words of the young noble girl from before. 450 pounds. A trained hound is priced between 450 and 700 pounds. City of Silver, at the bottom of the spire. Derek Berg was locked in a small room, eating food and taking his medicine regularly. As a result, his mental state rapidly improved as his visual and auditory hallucinations were no longer present. "I'll be able to leave in a day or two. It's really hard to stay locked up in such an environment for long periods of time. The former captain of the exploration team in the next cell has been locked up for 42 years, yet he's still very lucid and rational. If it were me, I definitely would have gone crazy." However, the explorations and strange monsters that he spoke of are rather attractive and even terrifying. Derek sat on the edge of the bed, looking at the candle that had burned to the end. Before the keepers delivered his next round of food and medicine, he would be placed in true darkness. At that moment, he saw a gray fog spread out as the deep voice of the fool sounded. "Prepare for the gathering." Such a change was fleeting. Derek focused his attention and subconsciously counted his heartbeats. However, he soon realized that this wasn't necessary because his current state was one of solitude, and he didn't need to avoid others. Derek, who was no longer counting his heartbeats, quickly thought of a question. Would Mr. Fool's subsequent actions of pulling me above the gray fog be discovered and detected when I'm within the confines of the seal of the mystical object at the bottom of the spire? These were two mystical items that had prevented the complete destruction of the City of Silver in the face of several calamities. In his nervousness and uneasiness, Derek, who had been unable to come to a decision, saw endless dark red lights gushing out of the void and engulf him. The small, enclosed room turned completely silent. Even the sound of his breathing had become extremely weak. Suddenly, the metal wall between Derek and the former exploration team's captain produced a tapping sound. This was the signal the two of them used if they wished to talk to each other. Tack. The other person bent his finger and knocked again. After that, what should have been a third tap, that followed in succession, didn't happen. After a long while, the tapping sound hesitantly rang out again. Following that, both rooms fell into silence, and not a single sound could be heard. After finishing her luncheon, Audrey practiced on the piano before returning to her bedroom while keeping track of the time. As she passed her father's study, she saw that the door was ajar, and a thick stack of papers lay on the table. Those weren't there before. Curious, Audrey slowed down and winked at Susie. As a spectator, Susie often needed only a small hint to understand what her mistress wanted her to do. Of course, she would also occasionally pretend that she didn't understand, only wishing to lie still. Susie, who had received the signal, trotted silently into the study, then stretched out her front paws, placed them on the edge of the table, and stood upright. She quickly glanced at the front page of the stack of documents, returned to Audrey's side, and said in a low voice, "Survey of living conditions at all levels in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district." "Audrey, what do those words mean?" "Survey of living conditions at all levels in East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district? Why did Dad suddenly commission this survey? I don't remember ever mentioning anything about this to him." Audrey was confused and didn't bother to answer Susie's question. She looked around, and seeing that the servants were at their stations and not paying particular attention to her, she raised her head slightly and calmly turned to enter Count Hall's study. At the desk, Audrey looked down at the report and saw that the title was exactly as Susie had described it. It's document typed by a typewriter. The investigator is a reporter named Mike Joseph. There's the goddess's sacred emblem at the bottom. Was this commissioned by the Church of the Goddess? But why is Father given a copy? Oh, father is a believer of the goddess, and the church wants him to provide some support on this matter? That's a good thing. Audrey made a preliminary judgment. She had originally thought of hiring others to do a similar investigation, but she felt that this was not in accordance with her intention of guiding others behind the scenes. It was very easy to be noticed and no longer be ignored by the other nobles, therefore, she had been hesitant. Audrey reached for the file and flipped through it. She found that Mike Joseph wasn't the only one reporting on East Borough, the dock area, and the factory district. There were also quite a few people who had made their own field investigations from different angles. Some of them even mentioned the proliferation of cults, and how some Beyonders were colluding with the gangs. Phew. Audrey looked at the clock in the study and saw that it was almost 3. She quickly gave up on reading the report carefully and returned the document to its original state. Before she left, she picked up a book and used it as a disguise for her purpose of entry. At 3 o'clock sharp. While the chiming of the hanging clock was still reverberating through the air, Audrey had already appeared inside the majestic palace via the dark red, illusory light and found herself beside the ancient long table. She smiled, stood up, and bowed in the direction of the seat of honor. "Good afternoon, Mr. Fool." Having received a light nod in response, she then respectively greeted the hanged man, the world, and company. She keenly noticed that the sun seemed to be a little uneasy. "What are you worried about?" Audrey asked. This spared Klein's need to speak, having also noticed that little Sun didn't seem right. Entering this mysterious space ahead of time, he tidied the items on the table, tossing them into a corner along with Azek's copper whistle, the biological poison bottle, Numinous Episcopat's copper whistle, and other things. He had then covered them with a thick fog. Presently, there was only the Dark Emperor card on the table before him. This was an item that matched the identity of the fool. Derek didn't hide anything and immediately recounted his successful malingering and how he was sent to the bottom of the spire to be isolated for treatment. Finally, he asked, "Honorable Mr. Fool, will that mystical item detect my participation in the tarot club?" "How would I know? I don't even know what it is. However, there are currently no strange or powerful forces attempting to invade." Even the eternal blazing sun and the true creator couldn't find this place. Klein tapped his finger on the edge of the long bronze table and replied in a relaxed manner, "Generally speaking, it wouldn't make any discoveries. But some mystical items possess special effects." Seeing that Mr. Fool had given an affirmative answer, Derek was immediately relieved. He tersely gave acknowledgement and said, "I'm not sure of its special effects either. It's one of the City of Silver's top secrets." At this point, he suddenly thought of what the former captain of the exploration team had told him. He blurted out a question, "Have any of you heard of a person named Amon?" "Amon?" After a moment's thought, Klein remembered the source of the familiarity. But he didn't answer in a hurry. Instead, he looked at the hanged man, knowing full well that this middle-ranking member of the Church of the Lord of Storms also knew Amon, and perhaps he knew even more than he did. Similarly, Audrey also looked at the hanged man. She had also heard the name from him the last time. Furs listened with a blank face, feeling that the things discussed here were always outside the scope of her knowledge. Alger frowned and asked in confusion, "You ran into a man who called himself Amon while you were exploring the surrounding areas of the City of Silver? Or perhaps, you discovered related records?" Derek nodded seriously and said, "Yes, 42 years ago, an exploratory team encountered a man claiming to be Amon in the depths of the darkness. After they returned to the City of Silver, they lost control one after another. Only one of them was left, and he was imprisoned at the bottom of the spire, in the cell next to me. Maybe he went mad too and that was just a figment of his imagination." Furs, with a wealth of novel creation experience, postulated a guess. Alger glanced at Mr. Fool who sat at the end of the table. Seeing him appear staid and without expressing anything, he boldly said, "Imagination is a possibility, but one shouldn't imagine the name Amon for no reason." He turned his head to the sun and said, "In the fourth epoch, about 1,500 years ago in the kingdom we live in, there was a family with strange powers. They belonged to the Tudor dynasty, and their surname was Amon. Even in an era with numerous high-sequence Beyonders, the surname of the clan was taboo. Just as Audrey asked instead of the son, why? The hanged man, Alger, didn't answer her directly as he continued on. Abraham, Antigonus, Amon, Jacob, and Tamara are the 5 great families that supported the establishment of the Tudor dynasty, and they were second only to the Blood Emperor. Among them, the Amon family is the most mysterious one. They have the least history left behind, and they seem to have been distorted and covered up by some kind of power. There was a piece of information that came from the king of the 5 seas, Nast. The Amons are a family of blasphemers, and they wield the secrets to usurp the powers of deities. Also, the Amon family call themselves the descendants of the ancient sun god. Derek Berg was left confused. In his knowledge of myths, there was no such thing as an ancient sun god. Among the 8 ancient deities, Giant King, Ormer, Dragon of Imagination, Ankwelt, Mutated King, Kvaster, Elf King, Siniathrim, King of Demonic Wolves, Fleegria, Vampire Ancestor, Lilith, Phoenix Ancestor, Gregrace, and Devil Monarch, Farbody, none of them wielded the power of the sun. Derek seriously considered this problem. If I really need to make a connection, the Lord that created everything, the omnipotent and omniscient God had shown powers in the sun domain. Could the Amon family be his descendant? Noticing that Sun wasn't saying anything, Alger stroked the stubble on his chin and said, "The Amon family is an ancient family clan from 1 to 2,000 years ago. It is almost history itself. I'm very curious, why did the gentleman that you met appear around the City of Silver? What is his goal?" That's right, how could the Amon family, which exists in the world of Mr. Hanged Man, Miss Justice, and company, appear around our City of Silver? Why did he fail to fulfill his promise after accepting the request of being a guest? He mysteriously left and caused the entire team to lose control. Yes, other than the captain. What did he want to do? What was he looking for? If he is a descendant of the Lord, perhaps his purpose is the same as mine, to find out the cause of the cataclysm from ancient times and to find out the truth of the curse. Derek let his imagination run wild for a moment. After a while, he shook his head and said, "Mr. Hanged Man, I'm unable to answer your question. I'm also trying to figure out this matter." Alger replied, looking somewhat disappointed, "Try to communicate with the former captain in your neighboring cell more. See if you can dig up more information from him." Upon saying this, he thought for a moment and warned, "However, you must be careful and prudent. I think that person is very dangerous." "Very dangerous? You think so too?" Derek asked, feeling somewhat surprised. The elders of the 6-member council also thought the same. The Hanged Man looked up at the lofty dome and took a deep breath. Those who don't think so are the ones without sound minds. Seeing that the son was still confused, he shook his head and said, "He's the only surviving member of the exploration team. Just this matter alone is enough to prove that there's something tremendously wrong with him. He's been in the dungeon facing rampagers for 42 years, yet, he remains very lucid and rational. This shows how weird he is. Compounded with the matter regarding the mysterious Amon, the danger is obvious." These were the little bits and pieces that Derek had thought about in the past, but he hadn't yet connected together. When he heard that, he suddenly became enlightened and immediately said sincerely, "I understand. Thank you, Mr. Hanged Man." Audrey, who was listening attentively and observing, resisted the urge to cover her face with her hand. She felt that the son was even more naive than she was. Seeing that everyone's curiosity had been satisfied, that even the gloomy Mr. World had slightly adjusted his posture, and that the son didn't seem to have any other requests, she turned her head to the end of the long bronze table and said with a smile, "Mr. Fool, I request a private exchange." Again. Klein was amused as he nodded and said, "Sure." He immediately shielded the senses of the Hanged Man and company, rather than isolating himself and Miss Justice. It was mainly because he was afraid that the others might end up communicating out of boredom, thereby exposing the fact that the world was only a repeater. After receiving the signal, Audrey smiled and said, "Mr. Fool, I have another 3 new pages of Roselle's diary." After the card of blasphemy was stolen by the fool's adorer, she didn't avoid visiting the Royal Museum out of guilt. Instead, she acted as if nothing had happened. She openly requested this to her father, and in the week after the exhibition ended, she got another chance to flip through the notebook. Audrey thought that appearing unfazed was the best way to avoid suspicion. If she maintained the constant act of feeling guilty and did not do what was logical, even if the Church of the God of Steam didn't suspect her previously, they would subsequently feel that there was a problem. According to her own experience, she believed that the very first few pages of a diary would reveal a lot of information, so she mainly memorized the first 3 pages. Without waiting for the fool to speak, she quickly added, "I understand that this isn't a matter that requires a private exchange, but I wish to keep this from Miss Magician for a week or 2. That way, even if she knows that you need Roselle's diary in the future, she wouldn't suspect that I'm Justice." She had seen Furs and Zaya once midweek, and by leading the conversation, she had naturally mentioned how her beloved dog, Susie, had chewed the Roselle notebook, causing it to be irrecoverable. Typically speaking, she no longer needed to hide the fact that Mr. Fool needed Roselle's diary, but using her telepathist abilities, she simulated what Furs would think, believing that she would have such a thought. "What? That's a diary? That's a diary Roselle recorded his secrets in? Even Mr. Fool places so much importance on it. I recall that Miss Audrey has some." Wait a moment. She happened to have those diary pages chewed up by her dog a few days ago. Isn't this too much of a coincidence? To prevent Furs from having such thoughts, Audrey hoped to keep it a secret for at least another week. After becoming a telepathist, not only was she able to see the aura and the emotional color of the target, but she was also able to read the superficial thoughts of others and could also simulate their thoughts. Thus, she understood one thing, that in the process of guiding others, she had to try her best not to be abrupt or act against logic and reason. Only when all the details were subtle enough and reasonable enough to make the target not realize that she was being guided, would she be considered a qualified telepathist. Subtle and reasonable are the 2 most important keywords, Audrey concluded in her mind. The reason why she went to read Roselle's notebook again was precisely to avoid being unreasonable. She truly is worthy of being a telepathist. She's recognized long ago that Miss Magician is one of the 2 people that she had recommended. Klein smiled in a noncommittal manner. "What do you want to exchange those 3 pages for?" This question was asked with confidence because, after obtaining the Book of Secrets, his greatest weakness in the field of mysticism had already been bridged. As for the secrets of the other deities, as well as his knowledge of sequences, he knew a lot about them. Just any one of them was enough to deal with Miss Justice. "We will still be friends if you don't talk about the psychiatrist formula," Klein lampooned in his heart. Audrey had already long thought of her question. She remained reserved for a second before saying, "Mr. Fool, I wish to ask one question. Why is it said that the cards of blasphemy hide the profound secrets of the deities?" "Great question." Klein smiled secretly. Giving her a look for her to figure it out herself, he said deeply and calmly, "Sequence 0, Dark Emperor." "Sequence 0? There's still a Sequence 0? There's a Sequence 0 above Sequence 1? Is that a sequence representing a god? The Dark Emperor is a god?" A series of questions suddenly surfaced in Audrey's mind. This caused her to be pleasantly surprised, satisfied, and shocked. Restraining her agitation and unconcealable excitement, she took a deep breath and conjured the 3 pages of Roselle's diary. Klein took it, took a quick glance, and confirmed that this was not one of the ones he had seen before. February 23, 1143. I've transmigrated to this world for more than a week. I have to write something down and describe the things I have encountered, or I feel like I'll go crazy. If I write it in simplified Chinese, I'm sure that no one will be able to decipher it. This world uses alphabetical words. I am now Roselle Gustave, but I'll never forget my real name. Huang Tao. I don't know how I transmigrated either. I carefully recalled and thought about it for a long time, and then I remembered that a few days before my transmigration, I bought a very mysterious silver plate with some strange symbols and patterns engraved on it. It was extremely interesting. However, it did not reappear after my transmigration here. It's not my cheat item. This is a world similar to ancient Europe. It's after the Renaissance, and cannons and guns have appeared, but they're rather crude and primitive. As for me, Huang Tao Roselle Gustave, as a fan of online literature, I loved reading transmigration with technology genre novels. I know quite a lot of useful things and specifically read up on the corresponding knowledge. This is the stage where I can display my abilities. But, I realized that my F*** king memory isn't good. I've almost forgotten everything. The heavens allowed me to transmigrate to another world, but I wasn't given an outstanding memory or a system. Nor was I given a two-way door. How can I survive like this? Alright, I'll start with some details. When I have the money, I'll hire a bunch of craftsmen, inventors, and scientists. I'm only responsible for giving them ideas. It's been a long time since I've felt so full of anticipation for the future. But I still miss Mom and Dad a little. Besides, the entertainment in this world is too monotonous. The one or two maids don't look that good, and their entire bodies exude rustic vibes. It completely shatters my imagination derived from Hongshou.com novels. I haven't finished reading Lin Gao's 500 Good-for-Nothings, and there are so many beauties that are awaiting me on TikTok. The games, Kings of Glory and PUBG, are still waiting for me. Thinking about them makes me feel a little depressed. As Klein read, he nearly frowned. Initially, he had determined, from the appearance of Pirate King and the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, that Roselle had crossed over 3 to 5 years earlier than him. But now, he realized that the gap between their transmigrations couldn't be more than a year. But why was there a difference of nearly 200 years on this side? China Literature's platform, a sister platform of webnovel.com, that caters to Chinese white-collar female readers. A web novel that has been serialized since 2009, talking about 500 transmigrators. Klein thought seriously for a while and came up with all sorts of theories, but because he lacked the necessary information, he could only temporarily ascribe the cause of the matter to the difference in the flow of time between the Earth and this world. Roselle and I have transmigrated less than a year apart, but in this world, we are separated by nearly 200 years. That is to say, even if I were to spend 200 years to find a way to return, it's likely that I won't lose the opportunity to meet my parents. At most, I'd have been missing for a year. Klein made a contrasting inference, improving his mood significantly. He instantly felt filled with motivation. Of course, he himself knew very well that this reasoning was not rigorous, because this was determined by one precondition, and it was currently impossible to confirm it. What if Roselle transmigrated after me? That might involve so-called spatial-temporal turbulence. When the time comes, there is no guarantee that I'll return to the proper time node. Klein poured cold water on his burgeoning mood. Roselle's first diary entry was the product of having held back for a long time, therefore, it took up more than 2 pages. Klein flipped to the end and read the remaining 2 lines. February 25th. What a boring world. There are no newspapers and so few novels. I think I need to help this culturally impoverished society, but the premise of this is that I have to get some money and recall how paper is made and how the print press is done. As a transmigrator, I can only live on the pocket money that my new dad and mom gave me. I can only occasionally see 1 or 2 shiny Firmo gold. What a tragic story. However, hunting is quite interesting. February 28th. This world might be a little different from what I know it to be. I got lost while hunting in the woods today. As a result, I saw an unimaginably intense battle. In the battle, the man who was surrounded had additional eyes growing on his face, a total of 4 eyes. They even shot dark green light. This is F****king illogical. Is this a humanoid monster? This is actually a fantasy world, right? That monster's opponent was even more powerful. He summoned a pillar of light that burned with golden flames. Yes, I think it was summoned. Fortunately, they didn't discover me. After getting rid of that monster, that person left with the corpse. I, Huang Tao, am indeed the protagonist. I discovered the truth of this world a few days after I transmigrated. Perhaps they can recognize the mysterious symbols and patterns on the silver token. Of course, I won't ask. I want to become like them and crack it myself. There's another key reason as to why I said this. I can't even ***king remember what the pattern looks like. I can only vaguely remember it. Indeed, the protagonist? Emperor, did you pour all of your 8th grader syndrome soul into your diary? Klein couldn't help but lampoon. He was very interested in the silver plate, which might have been the cause for Roselle's transmigration, and he was eager to find out what the symbols and patterns on it looked like. If he could really decipher it by relying on the mysticism knowledge of this world, then transmigration might not have just been a coincidence. Klein put down the diary pages, wrapped his fingers on the table, and lifted the screen that isolated the hanged man and the magician. Go ahead and trade freely. Klein leaned back in his chair and smiled. First took a deep breath and said, I would like to purchase the stomach pouch of a spirit eater and 20 milliliters of blood from a deep-sea marlin. It will be paid for in gold pounds. I still have 430 pounds, I can afford one, she silently encouraged herself. As for where the rest of the money would come from, she had no idea. This is one of the main reasons that prevent many Beyonders from advancing. People cannot really attempt to spend beyond their means. If it wasn't for me having to become a trickmaster to completely be rid of the influence of the full moon's ravings, I wouldn't even consider advancement once I gained rich Beyonder means. I wouldn't even make contact with this circle. I'll write books, save up money, drink tea, and stroll the streets with Zio. Once she's finished with that task, we can travel to different parts of the northern and southern continent. We don't have to be afraid of danger or accidents, and we can enjoy life. Firza's thoughts suddenly began to wander. Just when she thought that no one would respond, Alger said in a low voice, I saw the deep-sea marlin's blood at the recent gathering of the great pirates, but unfortunately, you've already missed it. You should have said so earlier. No, I'm mistaken. You hadn't joined the tarot club back then. Then what's the point of saying this? Showing off your experience? Furs curled her lips secretly but said in all seriousness, Mr. Hanged Man, please keep an eye out for me. I can accept a price between 300 and 400 pounds. Alger sneered. The sea is even vaster than the land. Pirates might not even meet each other in half a year. Even on the islands that they dispose of their loot, Beyonder ingredients are seldom gathered. Only big cities like Backland, Trier, St. Millom, and Fainapotter can have many ingredients gathered together. From your accent, you should be a Backland citizen, or someone who has been living in Backland for many years. You mean that I still need to rely on myself? Furs almost looked up at the high dome. At this point, Derek said, I know roughly where a few spirit eaters are active. But I don't need the gold pounds you people talk about. Furs said with a fake smile, what do you want? The formula for the Solar High Priest potion. Audrey quickly answered inwardly. Derek thought seriously and said, the Solar High Priest potion formula. That's a sequence 7 formula, right? I've heard of it, but the formula for this sequence is at least 750 pounds, and if you're in a hurry to get it, it can be sold for more than 1,000 pounds. Furthermore, the stomach bag of a spirit eater and blood of a deep-sea marlin do not exceed 400 pounds each. They're only worth 300 pounds most of the time. Do you understand me? Furs tried to make it clear to the Sun that this was not an equivalent transaction. Without hesitation, Derek replied, I can give you 2 or 3 of the spirit eater's stomach bags. As for the additional need for a deep-sea marlin, he didn't even consider it. He had never even seen the sea before. What can I do with the additional spirit eater's stomach bags? Roast them or fry them? To be honest, I have no idea when I'll be able to sell it. Most importantly, I'm unable to afford the formula for Solar High Priest. Furs forced a smile and said, I'll try searching. She thought of the masked eternal blazing sun believer at Mr. A's gathering who was good at purification. She thought of the Band of Light ring, and she believed that she could get a clue to the potion formula of Solar High Priest. But I don't have enough money. first thought for a moment, touched her face, looked around, and then asked with great sincerity, "Everyone, do you have any good ways of earning money?" As soon as she finished her sentence, she realized that everyone had fallen into silence. Silence could be described by the soundless palace and the quiet gray fog. From the looks of it, everyone faces this conundrum. As for Mr. Fool, he doesn't need money. Furs wisely shut her mouth. Isn't the best way to make money be from owning farms, mines, plantations, factories, stocks, etc.? Oh, you can also go through the kingdom's bounty notices and complete them in accordance with the price and the period of time at a bearable level. Audrey knew that she didn't have any real experience in making money, so she could only respond with a few words in her heart as if she was joking. "Might I interest you in bicycle projects?" Klein resisted the urge to manipulate the words of the world, which would expose his true identity. After waiting for a few seconds, he maintained an unfathomable posture, making the world gloomily and hoarsely say, "Help me keep a lookout for the thousand-faced hunter's mutated pituitary gland and blood, as well as a human-skinned shadow's characteristic and a deep-sea naga's hair." Although Klein only had 589 gold pounds left, he now had the beyonder characteristic of a werewolf and the biological poison bottle. Furthermore, he was considering to find an opportunity to turn the former into a mystical item and then sell one of them. In that case, that's more than enough to match the cost of Sequence 6 Beyonder ingredient. Therefore, he planned to have the members of the Tarot Club help him pay attention in advance so that he wouldn't miss them. "All right." The son, Derek, answered first, but he made no promises. Compared to a spirit eater, human-skinned shadows and thousand-faced hunters aren't monsters that are easy to encounter. Thousand-faced hunter? I think I've seen a fossil of it, Justice thought as she replied, "Yes, I'll confirm that after I return." That fossil was in Duke Negan's treasury. If it's already a fossil, its beyonder characteristic has probably long been taken away. Klein manipulated the world and nodded noncommittally. After a moment of silence, Alger said, "Help me keep an eye out on a person who was involved in the disappearance of the colonial slaves that was mentioned before. He calls himself Balin, a man with reddish-brown skin and has the clear characteristics of a southerner, but someone has overheard him speak in a backland accent. The third tooth on his left is missing, but it could very well have been replaced. In addition, there's nothing special about him, and his height is also quite average. If you can find traces of him, there will be no problem with the reward at all, with it being at least 100 pounds or something of equal value. Even divination can't be completed with such a description, let alone carrying out a search for the person in the real world." Klein looked around and said, "Continue with your free exchange." At the end of the tarot gathering, Derek returned to the real world and found himself in the dark, cramped room. He sat on the ground cautiously for a few seconds, but he didn't discover any unusual changes. He was finally able to let out a sigh of relief. Remembering that Mr. Hanged Man had advised him to talk more with the former exploratory team's captain, Derek walked over to the corresponding metal wall, bent his fingers, and tapped on it. Tack. Tack. He completed his signal, but there was no response even after a long time. Did he fall asleep? Or was he taken to the 6-member council? Derek wondered while looking at the dull metal wall. At this moment, an elderly and fleeting voice came from the bed behind him. "Are you looking for me?"